the side to go brighter or dimmer if you needed to. All right. Let's see here. So let's continue. Chapter on policy and power. We are on page 179. Now, hold on. Reading under the subtitle topic prevention. Safety and community well-being are supported by efforts and structures that prevent harm from occurring in the first place. Because violence is contextual, most effective prevention efforts include the broad distribution of social supports that make violence unlikely and healing accessible, including quality schools, housing, jobs, healthcare, mental health, and substance use treatment, and after-school programs. Recognizing the degree to which mental health and substance use challenges drive substantial portions of crime and violence, for instance, compels us to develop a robust and accessible treatment infrastructure that does not require a court mandate as a prerequisite for help. That said, the concept of prevention can be misleading. We cannot prevent our way into safety while keeping our responses to existing violence the same. Prevention is appealing. What better response to violence than to keep it from happening in the first place? But an emphasis on prevention all too often includes a narrowing impulse that discards anyone who has already committed harm or been harmed. It rings like a longing for some kind of clean slate, as if we could say, we will start with these children here, and we will do right by them in ways we have not done right by the ones who came before. And they will grow into happy, healthy adults, and all of this violence will be behind us. It is an understandable wish, but also a fundamentally dishonest and unaccountable way. 1. It betrays our longing to avoid facing the impact of what our current policy choices have produced. There is no world where we can raise safe children without supporting the well-being of the teenagers and adults in their lives, and the desire to do so is dangerously ahistorical. Moreover, focusing on prevention, particularly with an emphasis on early childhood, often betrays an implicit racial bias in our estimation of who constitutes a child. Studies show that white people consistently misperceive the age of children and young adults of color, often overestimating their age by nearly 5 years. White people's inability to see the child in other children of color is matched by an increased perception of dangerousness of adolescents and adults, particularly adolescents and men of color. And I've always said I don't personally think that white people have trouble estimating the age of black children. I think that it's a psychological or a subliminal message that they're sending that equates black people to animals. That goes back to a very historically racist practice. That's why the case of Tamir Rice, you cannot tell me that a grown man thought that a 12-year-old boy was old enough to do him harm, or he thought that this 12-year-old was a grown man, or they tried to show that Tamir Rice, because for example, if you saw a adolescent lion, you wouldn't know the difference between an adolescent lion and a grown lion. But with human beings, you can tell the difference between a child and a grown man. You know, I've seen some older looking youth, but I've never mistaken a 12-year-old boy for a grown man, and I refuse to believe that a white person is something wrong with their optical development, that they cannot judge the difference between young black men and adults. I don't believe that for a minute. But it's a way of equating black people or people of African descent to animals. Unexamined, those biases will steer us toward dangerously narrow conceptions of prevention, ones that are focused only on young children who have not yet committed harm or been harmed. What is more, prevention allows us to evade the issue of repair, as if we do not have to own the harm we have caused to people who are already hurt, to face their pain and our responsibility for it. But every 5-year-old lives in a home with adults, and many live in homes with teenagers, often with teenagers who have been in trouble or caused harm or both. Children's parents are incarcerated. Their older brothers are shot. Their sisters and brothers are sexually assaulted. Their aunts and uncles are treated unfairly by the police. Their grandparents get inadequate health care, and their ancestors' losses live in their bones. We cannot isolate the children we perceive as innocent from the other people in their lives whom we hold responsible somehow for their own suffering. This means that a true focus on prevention requires an intergenerational approach to community well-being. Prevention at its best and most honest is rooted in an awareness of the interconnectedness of different segments of a community, of the ways in which that interconnectedness can be a source of pain, but also one of the ways in which it is the very fabric that can hold a healthier community together. Okay, the next part is called relocating the locus of control to define and secure safety. Relocating the locus of control to define and secure safety. There is no single proven model that can replace the current failing approach to violence, nor will there ever be one solution to the wide variety of interlocking challenges that produce violence in communities. But there are crucial lessons from promising interventions for violence that, given sufficient investments to develop them, and others at anywhere near the scale of investments in incarceration, could diminish violence in ways punishment alone never will. Central to these lessons is the fact that law enforcement alone will never solve the problem of violence, and that the locus of control to define and secure safety must be relocated into the hands of the people whose lives are at stake. One strategy common to a variety of interventions that show the greatest promise is the engagement of credible messengers in the work. Credible messengers are people who leverage their moral authority and experience to support people involved in violence and transforming their behavior, ceasing violent activity, and becoming safe. Credible messengers often belong to the communities where violence is occurring, have survived and or committed violence themselves, are familiar with and often have been a part of the street culture, and have authority rooted in their experience in that culture. Their subsequent cessation from violence in their role as leaders in their neighborhoods. While the term credible messengers may be new, the concept is not. Neighborhoods across the country have, for generations, been relying for leadership on the wisdom of what Albino Garcia calls the BTDTs, the been there, done that's. Countless grassroots violence intervention programs work in just this way. The cure violence model, which has been replicated nationally and has demonstrated significant contributions to the reduction of shootings in neighborhoods where it has been deployed, has formalized the deployment of credible messengers as a defining feature of its strategies. These messengers work day and night and run toward violent conflict as it occurs. They stand literally and figuratively between people on opposite sides of a dispute and work to diffuse situations that could escalate into deadly violence and to halt cycles of retaliatory harm. They mobilize their lived experience to create peer-to-peer and sometimes elder-to-youth connections that can interrupt violence as it occurs. They do not, notably, work closely with the police. The efficacy of these strategies makes sense, as we know that people tend to trust the counsel and direction of people who have shared their experience more than that of those who have not. There is a reason why AA sponsors are people who have struggled with alcoholism. However, logical the successes of these formal and informal models may be, it is important to note that they invert the long-standing presumption that people who have committed violence should be separated from others rather than given the opportunity to lead others to more peaceful resolutions of conflict. Even those programs that do not stand in the crossfire when violence arises have succeeded by engaging the people most likely to cause or survive harm, who are almost always the same people. The community-based ROCA programs have produced extraordinary results in their work with street and gang-involved youth outside of Boston. A central facet of the ROCA model is the engagement of young people at highest risk of incarceration, injury, and death. They work by developing trust in relationships and use restorative justice strategies rooted in connection, persistence, and a belief in all people's capacity to change. They have demonstrated substantial success in helping young people stay out of the justice system, obtain and retain employment, stay involved in the lives of their families and children, and develop durable connections to the program and their communities. Community-centered approaches like these, when adequately supported, hold out a degree of promise that prison never will, in part because they stand to produce stronger results, and also because prisons, they can reach people law enforcement does not, and can engage them and change voluntarily. A central feature of some of the most successful violence intervention efforts is the creation of ways to access support that are separate and independent from the criminal justice system. Given high levels of distrust of law enforcement, particularly in low-income communities across the country, any reliance on police as a primary or exclusive pathway to care and intervention will inherently fall short and will miss those at greater risk of harming others or being harmed themselves. Knowing that, the programs in the National Network for Hospital-Based Violence Intervention Programs, including Healing Hurt People in Philadelphia, Kings Against Violence Initiative, KAVI, in Brooklyn, Youth Alive in Oakland, and Detroit, in Detroit, life is valuable every day. create conduits to support through the emergency rooms where people are treated for injuries resulting from violence. Research shows that 1 in 5 survivors of shootings will later be killed in another violent incident. Deploying a mix of credible messengers and or trained social workers and engaging emergency room clinicians as partners, these projects seek to halt cycles of violence by managing immediate risk of retaliation in the short term and engaging the survivors of violence in trauma-focused care in the longer term. Ranging from therapeutic groups to employment support and safety planning, the services these programs provide aim to reverse the trend wherein surviving a shooting places someone at far greater risk of future involvement in violence, and instead use that event as an opportunity for intervention and transformation. The project earns the trust of the communities they are part of, and that trust positions them to be a force for safety and reconciliation when needed. And as I was saying earlier, I don't see any reason why all cities, all governmental agencies, or all non-for-profits, all community groups aren't using best practices or aren't informed about successful programs nationally or even internationally. Why is it that certain municipalities, government agencies, governments, or school systems are still not using the best practices to address the population of people that they work with? This is an abomination to me. And many of the books or the sources that are being read here should be prerequisite reading before you can talk about addressing issues of violence, crime, crime prevention. There are many examples of successful programs and models that can be studied and used to address some of the issues that are affecting us locally. All right, the next part is called decoupling victim services from law enforcement. Decoupling victim services from law enforcement. I would like to know how decoupled is the Family Peace Center in Rockford from law enforcement. Is there a decoupling dynamic between the Family Peace Center in Rockford that's receiving a lot of money and law enforcement? Because the Family Peace Center is supposed to be for the victims of domestic violence. So, knowing that the history of what they call low-income people with distrust for police is what it is, that has to, even the community safe houses around Rockford, those that have police headquartered inside of the house, can't be serious about people in the community trusting those houses. And that's why some of those houses have earned the name snitch houses. You can't say that you're studying and following best practices if you have a community safe house that has an office for the police department. The expansion of the victim services field, with its focus on intimate partner and sexual violence, holds lessons of all kinds about what it will take to make these services equitably available to survivors in this country. On the one hand, the field has taught us the extraordinary impact a movement can have on a culture. 30 years of advocacy for victims has brought about lasting, paradigmatic change in our culture's response to domestic and sexual assault, and has reached millions of victims of these and other crimes. This work has taught us that healing can be brought to scale and that a culture can be brought along in doing that. The field has developed models for safety planning and support that have transformed survivors' lives, and the movement has ensured access to those supporters. So as we said, locally here in Rockford, domestic violence has been called the root of a lot of the violence in Rockford. Weirdly enough, one kind of violence is being called the root of other forms of violence, which is ridiculous. But the fact that we have some models already that show that if you're going to be successful and really impacting positively the lives of victims, you have to have some independence from law enforcement. But this service infrastructure teaches other lessons too. Despite the formidable work of many to ensure otherwise, the victim services field has not achieved equity in service delivery. Far too many victims are far too often left out of the scope of care, rather because of limited resources, lack of transformation, implicit bias, or an emphasis on partnership with law enforcement. The field has struggled to reach many survivors, including immigrants, young people of color, people with disabilities, women of color, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people, and other historically marginalized communities. When people belong to more than one of these groups, they are even more likely to be excluded from services. And aligning victim services too closely with law enforcement, rather by requiring a report to police as a condition for receiving victim compensation, co-locating victim services within law enforcement agencies, or encouraging survivors to report the harm they survived to police without first understanding the implications for their safety, will always exclude survivors when they or their communities have fraught experience with police. The author is emphasizing this point. It's not me putting the emphasis on the fact that best practices or research shows that agencies or institutions that are supposed to be for victims but have such a close link or relationship with law enforcement, people can't tell the difference, or people can't tell that there's a distinction. And that's why I said that you have community safe houses in some of the most underserved communities in the city. You have these safe houses, and the police have an office there. Sometimes you walk in and you see the police. That means that the people that are instituting these programs are either ignoring research or just are not competent in the field that they are working in. We see this perhaps most clearly in cases of harm within families. Even criminal justice practitioners who believe the system is effective in addressing street or gang violence will typically admit how greatly the system struggles to address intra-family harm productively, including domestic and intimate partner violence and child sexual abuse. This kind of harm represents a substantial portion of the violence that exists mostly out of reach of the criminal justice system and is far too often unresolved or even worsened on the occasions when it is addressed within it. The solutions to these kinds of harm are beyond the scope of this book, but not beyond the scope of what is possible. What is perhaps most important to note here is the degree to which experience suggests that the best answers to intrafamilial harm will almost always come from within communities, not outside them. Speaking from her experience as a survivor of child sexual abuse, Sujatha Baliga attests to not only the inadequacy but the danger to her family. For some reason, the lady's name is in lowercase letters. Starts with lowercase letters. Danger to her and her family of the alignment of support in law enforcement, what she calls the mix the word crime and immigration, child protection system, cluster muck of South Central Pennsylvania. The child protection system cluster muck of South Central Pennsylvania. She says it was this system that was the reason my father got to continue sexually abusing me. She has explained this concept in greater detail. Or my mother being deported or in being taken away from my family. Even as a child, I knew that if I told anyone what was happening in my home, any of these things could have happened, especially because for much of my childhood, we were the sole immigrant family in our rural patch of America. This is really important for us to understand, that the systems designed to protect us are actually doing us harm because they disincentivize truth-telling and help seeking. Sujatha's experience is shared by an enormous portion of survivors for whom, for a variety of reasons, the engagement of law enforcement is regarded as likely to increase rather than diminish the threat to their safety and the safety of their families. Although its work is not limited to intrafamiliar or intimate partner violence, creative interventions is a leading force in imagining better solutions to these types of harm, aiming to build the capacity of everyday people and communities to end and prevent interpersonal violence, and to shift the anti-violence movement away from individualized social services and criminalization and toward community-based responses. These and other aligned solutions draw on the experience, power, and ingenuity of communities to address the wide range of harms and violence that persist through generations, poison relationships, thrive on silence, and remain painfully unresolved by the often counterproductive intervention of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. A wide range of programs embody the insight that responding to violence must also heal those who survive it. Most of the beacons of promise in this work are grassroots, neighborhood-grown organizations led by and for the people who are most directly impacted. These programs include Fathers of Families of San Joaquin in Stockton, California, which promotes strong, healthy families and communities in which youth are nurtured and fathers are engaged in their children's lives. Life After Uncivil Ruthless Acts in Los Angeles, which takes a holistic approach to victim services, offering support and resources to the families of both the victim and the person responsible for a crime. In doing so, they work with their partners at the Reverence Project, which develops comprehensive wellness centers in urban communities to support those suffering from trauma. Mothers of Murdered Children in Detroit, which offers self-help groups, help for survivors and their loved ones in navigating the criminal justice system, grief counseling, and support with funeral costs, basing its work on the idea that grief must be shared in order for people to heal, and countless others. Across the country, the National Compadres Network draws on culturally rooted healing practices to treat survivors of violence to help ensure that they do not pass their pain on to others. And while not always grassroots based, the successful Trauma Recovery Center in California notably have been broadly replicated nationally through funds that come from reducing criminal penalties. The direct availability of these healing supports and community runs contrary to the pattern of exclusion that arises when victim services and law enforcement are too linked and is crucial to reaching the full range of crime survivors, including survivors with complex lives. So people often say that people like to talk about problems more than solutions. And as we try to mark and consider solutions and strategies and tactics, please note and look into some of the philosophy or the guiding principles of the Peace Center, the Family Peace Center in Rockford. How closely related or linked are they to law enforcement? When you go inside the Family Peace Center, I believe it's open. How long is it that you're in the Family Peace Center before you see police or police presence? If you see a close link or you can find, even sometimes it might be in their guiding principles and their mission statement. If you go on a website, you may see the police shield at the bottom or something like that. That shows you that there is not even an attempt to follow best practices or to follow models that have actually been proven to work for victims of crime and violence, family or otherwise. The direct availability of these healing supports and community run contrary to the pattern of exclusion that arises when victim services and law enforcement are too linked, and is critical to reaching the full range of crime survivors, including survivors with complex lives. Our media, our culture, and even some of our statutes continually reinforce the idea that to be deserving of care, a survivor of crime has to be innocent. This is a theme that is reoccurring in some of the literature that's being read, and that whole idea that was talked about in some of the cases in Rockford, that we as a community have to understand that waiting for the perfect victim or only supporting people when they appear perfect or without blemish or even innocent is not conducive to positive change or properly addressing crime and violence victims or the victimizers, or rehabilitating people that are involved in crime. Hold on, let me go back. Sometimes innocence is tied to some intangible yet narrow notion of purity that our culture uses to assign value and recognize vulnerability. Sometimes innocence is a matter for the courts, the opposite of legally determined guilt. And sometimes innocence sits in statute, as with the regulations that guide the distribution of Federal Victims of Crime Act funds. These funds help certain victims address the financial impact of the crime they experienced by reimbursing victims for costs associated with crime, such as hospital bills that insurance did not cover, the replacement of essential property, emergency relocation expenses, some therapeutic services, and in cases of homicide, burial expenses. The federal statute that guides the distribution of these funds, which are dispersed to states, which then disperse them to eligible victims, requires that the funds go only to innocent victims of crime. In almost all cases, the statute also requires that those victims of crime report to the police and cooperate with the investigation fully. In spirit and practice, both intentionally and inadvertently, the idea of innocence and the requirements of reporting and cooperation exclude a wide range of people from services and limits the options and resources available to people who survive serious harm. We've heard that a lot in Rockford. You would hear, representatives of the police department, the state's attorney or whatever come out and say, well, we can't solve these crimes unless the community comes forward, unless someone tells us something. It's like, are you forgetting the entire history of the country, of this community? Are you neglecting to acknowledge that that's not going to happen? And that you have large budgets of detectives and forensic experts exactly to deal with that. No one waits. The police department does not wait on community or people, snitches or whatever, to tell them things before they solve violence committed against police, violence committed against property. They didn't wait for someone to tell them. Well, I won't go into that. Victims who do not choose to participate fully in a police investigation or prosecution of a person who hurt them can and often do have their applications for compensation rejected for failure to cooperate. Still, other victims are rejected for what is called contributing conduct, essentially an assessment on the part of the state that the victim was at least partially responsible for the harm they sustained. The problem with these restrictions stems from the fact that survivors' experience with reporting the harm they survived can be fraught. Survivors often say they felt blamed or met with disbelief when trying to report the violence they experienced. These barriers to reporting are intensified for people from marginalized communities, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, transgender, and gender nonconforming people, in part because of outright and implicit biases, and in part because first responders are often not trained to understand their identities or their relationships, and thus cannot assess these types of violence as effectively and accurately as necessary. We also know that many other groups of victims, including people of color and members of immigrant communities, have had negative experiences with law enforcement that affect their sense of trust and safety when reporting, and many encounter bias when they report the harm they survive. Similarly, people too often experience bias and other barriers to accessing law enforcement based on language, ability, HIV status, and other facets of their identities. Tie-in compensation and services to cooperation with law enforcement limits access to critical healing services, inequitably excludes the most vulnerable survivors, and is distinctly not survivor-centered because it prioritizes the apprehension and punishment of the person who caused harm over the needs and preferences of the person harmed. It is decidedly defendant-centered. It is a decidedly defendant-centered approach to addressing crime. Recentering healing services around the survivors to whom they are owed will require no longer treating victims as mere instruments of police and courts, and instead decoupling services from enforcement in a way that enshrines and policies our belief in their deservedness of care. This reorientation will be entirely consistent with the relocation of the locus of control from law enforcement to communities more broadly. Among the people who will lead the charge to make the changes outlined here are not only formerly incarcerated people and their loved ones, but also crime survivors, a broader range of survivors than those whose voices we are used to hearing. Among those whose voices are typically excluded from the public understanding about violence and the best responses to it are not only survivors who are not innocent enough, but also survivors who are not deemed to be who they are supposed to be, and survivors who do not want what they are, quote, supposed to, end quote, want. Those who are inadequately or inappropriately afraid too silent or too outspoken, too angry or not angry enough, too forgiving or not forgiving enough, too political or not political enough, insufficiently innocent, too addicted, too violent, too volatile, too complicated. These are survivors who are concerned not just with interpersonal violence, but with state violence as well. Not just with their own trauma, but with the trauma passed through generations. Not just with themselves, but with the people who hurt them. Not just with their own safety, but
Oh, is it the? Oh, put it on the top one. You see how that one's on the bottom? Yeah, switch it.
not just with their own safety, but with what will make everyone safer. These are survivors who want revenge and compassion at the same time, and who change constantly but not linearly as they heal. These survivors' stories are messy, complicated, and uncontained. Almost all of us are these survivors. Developing adequate responses for these survivors, like achieving any of the policy shifts described above, will require a fundamental reorientation toward violence, toward those who commit it, those who survive it, and what it will take to end it. Some of those reforms will be fought and won in state houses around the country. But much of the terrain of this battle will not be only in the law, it will be in our culture. And the battle we will fight will be for a country that no longer regards violence as normal. It is only that country that will make the changes outlined here. That completes chapter 5. The opposite of, chapter 6 coming up. And as we've been asked, those that come up to read, to sort of give some insight of what they got out of what they read, I sort of said most of those things as I was reading, but if I was to say something briefly about what I read in its entirety, what sticks out to me is, one, that there are models, there are examples of best practices that we can look at. There's no reason for public entities, public organizations, state organizations, to not be using best practices or to be studying best practices. We've had instances where certain agencies actually went and brought back models that were not even close to being at the state of the art or having best practices. There's no excuse. The research is available. The literature is available. The data is available. There's no reason why in 2021 government or state agencies, if we look at the Family Peace Center, and not to be harping or throwing stones, but I haven't did the research myself, but I would like to look into whether the new Family Peace Center is following best practices in terms of how closely linked is law enforcement to the Family Peace Center. When you walk in there, is it a presence? Is it a vibration? Is the environment more law enforcement centered than it is survivor centered? And that's something we can look at, and that's something that people that say that they want to deal with solutions, we can start looking at all the entities, especially if you're going to set up locations or centers or operations in black neighborhoods, if you want to say it, or black communities of color, and you haven't studied the literature that's available to let you know that you should not be linking or making it seem like those, for example, the safe houses, they shouldn't have an office for the police, but don't even have an office for the people. In the neighborhood, the people in the neighborhood don't have an office, but the police have an office. But it's called the community safe house.
And the peace,
Go ahead.
the peace center thing you were saying. One of the mayor, and then it's a woman who was one of the chairmen of the board. But then the third person is Ken Wisenhand, assistant deputy chief. When you go to that website, you picture the mayor, woman, and then him.
So what I'm getting feedback is that what is he, the deputy chief? The assistant deputy chief is the third person listed on the Family Peace Center website. We as a community cannot stand for that because they're receiving public funds in our name. In the people are paying for that. If you're going to address, and if we were to look statistically into the people that suffer most for family or domestic violence, or the people who receive less healing in regards to that, you would be talking about people, families of color, immigrants and African Americans, and you don't know that the police have to be disconnected. I mean, they may, whatever role they would play in, whatever role that they would play, it definitely shouldn't be that it's a partnership between the agency and the police versus the community, or and you know, in a type of paradigm like that, especially when there's evidence of successful programs that understood fundamentally that they had to decouple. That's a new concept we can take note of, that they have to decouple from the police. And that's what I would say I got from it. Primarily that they're like, I would repeat, that there are models that we can study to try to deal with crime and victims and punishment and incarceration. And I don't know if we're going to take a break or if someone's going to slide in right now to pick up on chapter 6. It's time for the rundown, maybe. Let Terry do the rundown. Okay. So we're not going nowhere.
Okay. Okay, so that was Antar reading chapter 5 of Until We Reckon by Danielle Sered. Chapter 5 is entitled Policy and Power. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to get ready and have the Rockford rundown, and then we're going to have somebody pick up with chapter 6. We got another one of these days where we got the book of the previous day running into the next day, but we gonna stop that cycle tomorrow. All right, 1 second. You want to do the rundown?
Finish it?
How long has it been on? Only like 30 minutes. Yeah, because we just moved because of the rain. We had a long one going and the rain came. Getting out of here, Antar? Man, the rain is crazy. Don't put me straight to sleep. I guess I don't really need the rain to go to sleep. You got it on your phone?
Yeah.
You got it.
And the text. Hello. This thing is live. Hello? All right. Let me pull up the rundown. Here we are at the ongoing teach-in at Say Their Name Square. Just had a little bit of rain. We're underneath the overhang. Under the lights. see. Okay, here we are. Okay. On May 30th, 2020, a protest was organized by community activists in Rockford, Illinois, to march in solidarity with the city of Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd by police officer Derek Chauvin, and to bring awareness to the countless victims of police terrorism in the city of Rockford. During the protest speeches by members of the community, were given by members of the community, and a march was held that ended at Rockford Police District 1. At District 1, after speeches, a handful of people at the protest began throwing rocks and other objects at the District 1 building, but after discourse between community members, items ceased being thrown and no one was injured. The officers of District 1 stayed inside the building through the entirety of this happening. However, shortly after this, the district commander, Ken Wisenhand, led officers out of the building in riot gear. Before any order of dispersal was given, officers of the Rockford Police Department began assaulting people in attendance of the protest using cruel and unusual forms of brutality and violence. Pepper spray bullets, stomping, kicking, punching, tasing, slamming, and knees on necks were all used in efforts to terrorize children, teenagers, young adults, and the elderly. 10 people were falsely arrested, and over 100 citizens were physically and psychologically damaged by the actions of local law enforcement. These are the demands of the victims of the police brutality attack on May 30th in Rockford, Illinois. Demand number 1. We demand all charges in connection to the protest on May 30th be dropped immediately, without contingency on any agreement or being signed by the wrongfully accused parties. Demand number 2. We demand the city of Rockford procures an entity outside of the Rockford Police Department to investigate the actions taken by officers on May 30th due to the conflict of interest. Demand number 3. We demand the inherent biased findings of the Rockford Police Department investigation and the findings of the investigation done by an outside source be released in full without redaction to the public. Demand number 4. We demand to be informed of the badge number and name of each officer at Precinct 1 on May 30th, informed of each officer who made an arrest, and to be informed of each officer who discharged their taser. Demand number 5. We demand all elected officials in the city of Rockford condemn the actions taken by the Rockford Police Department on May 30th and also condemns the lack of results the investigation into the conduct of RPD on May 30th has yielded. Demand number 6. We demand the city of Rockford make accommodations and pay in full for the services of counselors, therapists, or psychiatrists, or anything else needed to help the mental health of those traumatized by the actions of their officers. The city should make accommodations for up to 12 months to pay these services for each individual. Demand number 7. We demand that all officers that participated in the violation of the human rights of the protesters on May 30th be terminated immediately and their crimes against humanity be punished to the fullest extent of the law. During the summer of 2020, weekly protests were hosted at City Market to raise awareness to the victims of the police brutality attack of May 30th in the city of Rockford, Illinois. For the first 5 weeks, these protests occurred with demonstrators assuming the role of pedestrians, walking continuously on the crosswalk on East State Street and Water Street, horizontal to City Market. Megaphones were used to project the voice of activists speaking about May 30th, and siren functions of those megaphones were used to alert traffic of the ongoing demonstration. a safety precaution. All of these things occurred with no arrests and no laws broken. The Rockford Police Department even went as far as to set up roadblocks using police vehicles on multiple weeks. On July 31st, in concert with the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department, the Rockford Police Department assaulted multiple demonstrators on the crosswalk of East State Street and Water Street in the process of arresting 14 people. For the next 8 weeks, the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department and the Rockford Police Department, along with the City of Rockford and the County of Winnebago, conspired to use terroristic tactics to intimidate citizens who participated in the protests at City Market. People were assaulted in a myriad of ways, including being pepper sprayed and slammed to the ground, in the process of 33 people in total being falsely arrested and jailed by law enforcement. The demands from #CityMarket2020. Demand number 1, we demand all charges in connection to the City Market protest be dropped immediately, without contingency on any deal or agreement by the wrongfully accused parties. Demand number 2, we demand an investigation into the violation of human rights in connection with the City Market protest by the Rockford Police Department, Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, Rockford Park District, Metro Enforcement Agency, and any other agencies involved. Demand number 3, we demand all elected officials in the City of Rockford and in Winnebago County to make a public statement about the violation of human rights of protesters by the Rockford Police Department. Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, Rockford Park District, and Metro Enforcement Agency in connection to the City Market protests. Demand number 4, we demand the City of Rockford and Winnebago County make accommodations and pay in full for the services of counselors, therapists, or psychiatrists, or anything else needed to help the mental health of those traumatized by the actions of their officers in connection to the City Market protest. The city should make accommodations for up to 12 months to pay these services to each individual. Demand number 5, we demand that the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office return all personal property, including but not limited to cell phones, speakers, and 20 megaphones, to the people who were arrested at the City Market protest. Demand number 6, we demand City of Rockford and Winnebago County ban the use of chemical agents by Rockford Police Department, Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, and Metro Enforcement Agency at areas the city and county designates as protest zones. Demand number 7, we demand Sergeant Tom Brimhall's son, Adam Pickett, be charged with assault and unlawful restraint for the actions he took on a protester July 31st at the City Market protest. Demand number 8, we demand that Kathy McDermott be terminated from her position at Rockford City Market and be replaced with someone who puts the community's interest above economic gain. Demand number 9, we demand Peter Provenzano and Rock River Development Partnership give ownership, all rights, and control of Rockford City Market to the City of Rockford so that it can be handled in a more equitable and democratic manner. Demand number 10, we demand that all officers that participate in the violation of the human rights of the protesters in connection to the City Market protest be terminated immediately and their crimes against humanity punished to the fullest extent of the law. On October 3rd, 2020, a protest began in the form of an occupation outside of Rockford City Hall after Tyrus Jones, an unarmed black man, was shot in the back by Rockford Police Department Officer Dominic McNeese on October 2nd, 2020 in Rockford, Illinois. The demands of the protesters organizing the demonstration were as reads. Number 1, a press conference from Rockford Mayor Tom McNamara. 2, in said press conference, Tom McNamara spoke on the shooting of Tyrus Jones and the ongoing police terrorism that took place in the spring and summer in Rockford, Illinois. 3, Mayor Tom McNamara answered questions from the media at said press conference. The mayor instead released a Facebook post 2 days after the shooting in which he never even stated the name of the victim he was referring to. In his statement, On October 5th, 2 of the protesters participating in the occupation were assaulted at the hands of the Rockford Police Department, in the process of 6 people ultimately being arrested. Since the demands the protesters put forward were never met in full, the occupation continued through this attack, and for the next 6 months, protesters continually occupied the outside of City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. While doing so, police officers have harassed, followed, and threatened citizens. They have torn down structures being used to house people in deadly cold weather. They have stolen blankets, hand warmers, food, and clothes from protesters in the middle of the night. The city officials of Rockford who work inside of City Hall have engaged in racist microaggressions throughout the entirety of the occupation, primarily executed in the form of white people weaponizing the police on people of color. The demands from the victims of Occupy City Hall. Demand number 1, we demand all charges in connection to the occupation at City Hall be dropped immediately without contingency on any deal or agreement by the wrongfully accused parties. Demand number 2, we demand all ordinance violations, fines, and parking tickets issued by the City of Rockford in connection with the Rockford occupation at City Hall be dropped immediately without contingency on any deal or agreement by the wrongfully accused parties. Demand number 3, we demand the City of Rockford, the Winnebago County State's Attorney, and the Rockford Police Department to release all video footage of arrests made in connection with the occupation at City Hall. Demand number 4, we demand each memorial in Say Their Name Square be up permanently without desecration from the City of Rockford or the Rockford Park District. Demand number 5, we demand the resignation of Assistant Deputy Chief Carla Red and Rockford Police Department Officer Brandon Mather for their assaults during arrests on individuals at occupation at City Hall. Demand number 6, we demand Tom McNamara hold a press conference open to the public addressing past cases of shootings by the police and the ongoing police terrorism in Rockford. Demand number 7, we demand the City of Rockford make accommodations and pay in full for the services of counselors, therapists, or psychiatrists, or anything else needed to help the mental health of those traumatized by the actions of their officers and employees in connection to the occupation at City Hall. The city should make accommodations for up to 12 months to pay these services to each individual. Demand number 8, we demand that the City of Rockford and the Rockford Police Department return all property taken from the occupation, including but not limited to canopies, a cell phone, blankets, chairs, and megaphones to the occupation at City Hall. Demand number 9, we demand Kyle Saunders be terminated from his position immediately and be replaced with an individual that puts the community's needs over the government's interests. Demand number 10, we demand all bans from City Hall property be lifted immediately without contingency on any deal or agreement by those involved in the occupation at City Hall. All right, there's your rundown. I'm going to take a little breather here and grab my drinks, and I'll be right back. Back to the reading. let's see how far we got. 253. And we're on page 190. So we got 63 pages. Chapter 6 of Until We Reckon. Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair by Danielle Sered. Chapter 6, The Opposite of Violence. Identifying police... Okay. Identifying police platforms that stand to increase safety and reduce our failed reliance on mass incarceration will be fruitless if we do not change the culture that drives and constrains those policies. The stories we tell and what we believe they obligate us to do will determine the scope of what is possible in our shared future. We are starting from a hard place. Our nation's culture is notoriously celebratory of violence. We see this in our military, our militarized local police forces, our leadership in the international weapons trade, and our popular culture. It is hard to think of a single blockbuster movie, for instance, in which the hero wins without using violence. Our stories of glory, of manhood, of bravery, and of strength almost all include violence as their central method. In The Matrix, a film about the pliability of reality and the expansiveness of what is possible, the lead character is in a large room, empty room, where he can conjure up anything he can imagine, anything at all, to help him secure justice. His answer: guns, lots of guns. Our American heroes beat people, shoot people, and detonate bombs. They are lethal weapons. They terminate. They die hard. We imagine our culture to be one that condemns certain forms of violence, particularly against those we consider innocent. We condemn sexual violence against children. We condemn murder. We condemn rape, particularly the rape of white women. Of course, we also tolerate these forms of violence in countless ways, including treating intrafamilial sex abuse of children with willful ignorance, murder as acceptable when the victims are poor people of color, and rape as territory of gray area replete with bragging rights. But somehow we think of these patterns as exceptions to an overall moral attitude of condemnation and righteousness about violence. Still, we do not valorize all forms of violence, and not every victim's pain is considered commonplace, and not all people who commit harm are portrayed as indifferent to others' pain. There are people whose pain still outrages our mainstream American culture, people who are not meant to be hurt, people we are meant to protect. Most of these people, it turns out, are white. America has a long history of disregarding the pain that people of color experience. I say America cautiously, knowing that the term actually includes a whole continent and not just the United States. But I use the term to mean this country alone because I am not exactly talking about the United States here in the sense of its geography or even its government. I am talking about America as an identity and a force, as an accumulation of history and narrative and ways of behaving in the world. I am talking about the America Langston Hughes evokes, the America James Baldwin evokes, the America, frankly, that Donald Trump evokes. I am talking about the cultural terrain that is so deeply contested in our current climate, the terrain we have to fight for if any of what is suggested here is to be possible. The terrain our opposition knows it has to control in order to win. There is a reason the hats do not say, "Make the United States great again." The fight is for America. This America's origin story, not to be confused with the lands, is one of the genocide of native people. Christopher Columbus and his men murdered, raped, tortured, poisoned, beat, shot, and starved people to death, and we take a day off every October to celebrate his exploratory spirit. We are a nation that could not exist but for a group of people's willingness and capacity to cause unimaginable harm. Forget George Washington. Our true forefathers are violence and pain. Then came the Middle Passage and all that followed, the vicious violence that characterized slavery, including whipping people with leather straps studded with nails, hanging people by their wrists for days while repeatedly beating them unconscious, raping people with wooden poles and broken glass, castrating men, cutting off people's fingers or hands, burning people to the brink of death and then reviving them only to hurt them further, dragging people by their ankles behind horse-drawn wagons, was treated as a natural and necessary part of business. What is more, as we inflicted this unthinkable pain, we promised the people we were harming that we would do the same to their children and to their children's children. As the visionary social worker Dr. Anna Ortega Williams was As the visionary social worker Dr. Anna Ortega Williams puts it, in this act of spiritual and psychological brutality, slavery promised enslaved people that we would inflict violence against all the versions of you that will ever be. We have never reckoned with that history. Passing an amendment that outlaws slavery, except as punishment for a crime, does not constitute reckoning. Our centuries-long silence continues to reinforce the normalcy of the extreme violence that characterized what we euphemistically called a peculiar institution. And slavery was peculiar, not in the moral, colloquial sense or of strange or unusual, but in the sense of being one's own, something distinctive to or characteristic of a particular place or people. It was anything but strange. It was ours, America's. It became the definition of normal, and so did the violence on which it depended. Of course, the way slavery normalized violence was entirely racialized and gendered. It treated white violence against people of color as not only a common practice, but even as an aristocratic one. To the extent that a white man's slaveholding was a reflection of his success, his status was defined in part by how many black people he had the power to hurt with impunity. The violence became so normal as to be called something else: discipline, management, control, even education. This normalization of violence against black people was held in place in part by the conjured fear of sexual violence against white women by black men. Any nation's self-definition includes defining who belongs and who poses a threat to those who belong. In the United States, a core part of our formative sense of ourselves included a story that white women were in danger and black men were dangerous, and that it was the job of white men to protect their women. Black men raping white women was extraordinarily uncommon, and still is. But the mere specter of this form of violence reinforced two inextricably intertwined myths: the danger and hypersexuality of black men and the helplessness and purity of white women. It is a story that allowed Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam to brutally beat a teenager named Emmett Till, drag him to the bank of the Tallahatchie River, shoot him in the head, tie him with barbed wire to a large metal fan, and shove his mutilated body into the water, all for allegedly whistling at Carolyn Bryant, a white woman. It is a story we still live today. Having never done the work to uproot its distortions, black men in the story are capable of horrible harm, but not vulnerable to pain or deserving of care. White women in the story are only vulnerable, cannot possibly be responsible for harm, and depend on their subservience to white men for protection and survival. White men are the supposed authoritative arbiters between the two, commanding fear and insulated by impunity, not only for violence against people of color, but also even for violence against white women, as the power holders in the very institutions that could, in theory, hold them to account, and black women who their pain and their power are all erased from the story, as though their bodies and experiences are somehow outside of and irrelevant to the justice equation. In that arrangement, none of us gets to be fully human. None of us has what we need to heal, both vulnerability and power, or to repair harm, both accountability and dignity, and none of us is positioned to fully regard our own or one other's humanity. It will be a great but essential labor for America to move from a story that regards violence against people of color as not only acceptable but necessary and noble, to a story that regards it as immoral and illegal. It is not a transition we, the descendants of Emmett Till and of J.W. Millam and of Roy and Carolyn Bryant, have yet made. We see the persistence of the age-old story in police killings of black men, in the public silence over killings of transgender women of color, in the presence of armed police officers in predominantly black elementary schools, and in seemingly simpler places like doctor's office and emergency rooms, where care is distributed inequitably and withheld cruelly. One of the capacities white people will have to develop out of the ravages of our history is our capacity to believe in the existence and importance of black pain. We will have to do it historically and politically, but we will also have to do it literally. A 2012 study looked at racial bias and perceptions of others' pain and found evidence that people assume a priori that blacks feel less pain than do whites. 4 of the experiments conducted show that white and black Americans, including registered nurses and nursing students, assume that black people feel less pain than do white people. Studies about the treatment of sickle cell, a disease that disproportionately affects black people, have revealed this trend writ large, as sickle cell patients have to wait 50% longer in emergency rooms to receive care. Their pain is vastly under-medicated, and their mortality rates remain unconscionably high, even in the presence of effective treatment options. Which we know about here a little bit because an unhoused man that was here for months while in the beginning of the occupation had sickle cell, and he was in and out of the hospital and not getting the care he needed. This is no small thing. People's belief in someone else's capacity to feel pain has enormous implications for empathy and treatment. Our vulnerability is a dimension of our humanity and is part of what entitles us to protection and care. We have to ask, how could it be possible that black people feel less pain than white people do? What would people have to believe that could be true? In the justice system, we can imagine that if system actors seem impervious to black men's pain, it has to do with the setting, that they are before them as defendants or even as victims in a larger context of criminal activity. What we learn from the medical research on pain management is that the basis for the regard for black pain isn't the narrow frame of the justice system. It is the much larger context of our culture's narrative about who can hurt and whose hurt matters. That narrative is at the heart of our ability to address all crime survivors equitably, because in a basic way, to believe you are a victim, we first have to believe you can hurt. Most of the stories we have told thus far have compromised rather than nurtured our ability to do so. It is time to start telling other stories. Let us start with a familiar story and tell it differently. The story about how a person becomes capable of committing violence. Our current approach often goes as follows. We look at arrest records, particularly for adolescents and young adults, and home in on the stories of young people who commit more and more violent crimes over time. The story we tell to explain this trend is one of children developing into violent criminals. We narrate the way that each offense paves the way for the next, that the punishments for the lower level ones are inadequate deterrents, that the people who commit these crimes are hardened in the process, or that they were inherently hard to begin with, and that they will inevitably go on to commit more and more violence. The story commands a broad audience, and it is wrong, the way all incomplete stories are. It suffers from the distortion our larger cultural normalization of violence promotes. For starters, even in a story that is entirely about violence, nowhere in it do we talk about the young people's own experience of victimization. While there is a great deal of research linking a child's maltreatment and exposure to violence to future violent behavior, far less research examines the reasons for the causality between the ongoing experience of violence and the decision to commit further or escalating harm. We do not lay the chronologies on top of each other. The U.S. Department of Justice and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence estimates that as many as 1 in 10 children in our country are poly victims, people who have served multiple kinds of victimization. Such experiences can have a cumulative effect. According to the final report of the United States Attorney General's National Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence, the toxic combination of exposure to family violence, child physical and sexual abuse, and exposure to community violence increases the risk and severity of post-traumatic injuries and health and mental health disorders for exposed children by at least 2-fold and up to 10-fold. These experiences play a central role in young people's development, particularly as it relates to violence. It is important to ask, what if part of what makes violence normal is surviving it? A decade of engaging responsible parties in common justice in an exercise that charts their experience of witnessing, surviving, and committing violence yields 2 key lessons. First, almost all people who commit violence report witnessing and or surviving violence before perpetrating it for the first time, and most report ongoing incidents of surviving harm interwoven with incidents of causing it. In other words, the experience of committing harm and the experience of surviving harm advance concurrently. For example, a young person may ditch school one day and be beaten up while outside. He may then affiliate with a person or group of young people he believes can protect him from further harm. He may participate in hurting someone with that person or group. He may then be retaliated against for his actions, survive a serious assault, and decide to carry a weapon. Okay. We're having a microphone battery issue. I'm going to try to fix that and be right back. All right. All right, here we are. Ongoing teaching at Say Their Name Square. Reading Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair by Danielle Sered. This is day 8 of the ongoing teaching. This is book 7. Okay. As a victim, he is a survivor of multiple potentially traumatic assaults over a short period. And of course, both of these realities require a response. But what it comes down to is this: almost no one's entry point into violence is committing it. Trauma symptoms themselves can become drivers of cycles of violence. Hypervigilance exaggerates survivors' sense of threat, so that a minimal threat can legitimately feel like a substantial and potentially even life-threatening one. How endangered one feels depends in part on the baseline of danger that exists. So, for survivors who are hurt in the context of relative safety, their exaggerated sense of danger may result in simple self-protective actions like crossing the street when they get a bad feeling about someone approaching, holding their keys as they approach their apartment, or carrying pepper spray in their bag. For people who live where there is a more widespread, regular threat of violence, where day in and day out they are making decisions that will affect whether or not they get home safe and alive, perceiving threats as more immediate than they are may mean that the self-protective actions people choose are graver. Not all survivors cope in this way, but many do. The way in which survivors cope, particularly in the early aftermath of harm, is not usually a matter of choice. Trauma, after all, has a way of pulling rank. Say a young man is suffering from hypervigilance and lives in a neighborhood where several people have been shot in the past week. He is walking down the street and hears someone approaching behind him. Before his traumatic experience, he was able to wait until that person was closer, get a feel for that person's intentions, adjust his body language to convey that he was not looking for trouble, and let the man pass. But now his mind and body are telling him that the danger he perceives is more substantial and more immediate than it is. If he believes that the man approaching him from behind means him harm, he cannot just wait for the person to reach him. He has to protect his life. So he turns. He says something aggressive to try to indicate that he is not someone this man should consider hurting. He throws the first punch. He shoots the first bullet. He does not experience this as an act of unprovoked aggression. He experiences it as self-defense. And his body tells him that that is exactly what it is. All too often we conflate cycles of violence with retaliatory acts, as though people only go out and hurt the people who hurt them. But that is not how these cycles work. We see this, for instance, in the literature about child abuse. People who were abused as children are more likely to pass that violence on, not to hurt their parents who abused them, but to hurt their own children. Cycles of violence are not primarily about giving pain back to its source. They are about paying that pain forward. Similarly, the young man who was nearly killed last week and is now walking down the block may be thinking not of retaliation, but of survival. And he may still cause harm. The second lesson is that the experience of surviving harm often is the most significant factor in contributing to a diminished sense of how serious violence is. This may be surprising to some of us, but only if we underestimate the large-scale normalization of violence against so many survivors. When someone survives violence, the range of options available is culturally determined. Those options have everything to do with what is accessible, what is sanctioned, and what is regarded as normal. When we look to the cultural basis for responses to violence, too often we look only as far as the neighborhood level, and typically end up blaming communities of color and poor communities for some supposed amorphous deficit in values that somehow make them unusually indifferent to violence. Pretending that culture is ever that local, that isolated, and that ahistorical is naive and dishonest, and insulates the broader American culture, including white people, from our responsibility for setting and reinforcing the norms that disregard black pain. That's because the culture that sets the norms about violence is broader than any neighborhood. The culture includes the larger economic structures that constrain what is possible in a given neighborhood, most of which are located and controlled far beyond that community's geographic or political reach. The larger context of media and its depictions of those involved in violence, whose locus of control is also not within the communities being represented, and the historical realities that endure through generations and legitimately infuse a community's understanding of itself. It is in this larger cultural context that survivors seek out strategies to cope with trauma, pain, and loss. People who are harmed have a range of coping strategies available to them, from seeking help, doing exercise, and going to therapy, to alcohol and other drug use, violence, and minimization or even total denial of the harm they survived. In deciding among these, whether consciously or unconsciously, people are more likely to choose coping strategies that are consonant with their culture's norms. For example, for many white women, particularly straight, cisgender, able-bodied, middle-class white women, this most often means a culture that says their pain is of importance, that they are in need and deserving of care and protection, and that their fear is legitimate. Hard as it still may be to do so, many of these women then do what those norms would suggest: acknowledge fear, express sadness and hurt, ask for help, and seek protection, often by any means necessary on the last count. For other survivors whose pain has been devalued by our society, there exists a set of norms insisting that their pain probably does not exist, and even if it does, that it does not matter. The coping strategy most consonant with that set of norms is clear. Many survivors survive by minimizing. Minimization involves rationalizing and downplaying the significance of an event or emotion. Those harmed may tell themselves it doesn't matter, it's okay, it happens to everyone, it's not a big deal, it's nothing. And that strategy may prove at least partially effective in helping them manage some of the symptoms of trauma they experience. But minimization also has downsides. First and foremost, it creates immediate and lasting barriers to acknowledging pain and fear and to seeking help. One cannot seek help for something that is nothing. This, coupled with the systemic denial of their trauma that drives minimalization in the first place, means that survivors whose experience of violence is normalized are less likely to seek or receive support for their trauma, more likely to live with unaddressed pain, and less likely to recover. Oh, I feel all that. I was a victim of violence on May 30th, and they said that the people that did it acted within 100% of the... There we go. And I tend to do the minimization thing, oh, it's nothing, and all that. All right. Many young men of color involved in common justice asked how they felt when they were robbed or assaulted. respond fine. Some of these young men are knowingly understating the intense emotions they felt when they were hurt. Our culture teaches men that their feelings should be limited more or less to fine, angry, aroused, or happy their team won. It does not make space for pain and vulnerability, but other participants are not obfuscating the pain they felt. Rather, they are essentially reporting a common trauma symptoms: numbness. Numbness and minimization as symptom and strategy go hand in hand, and both allow people to not feel pain. The problem is that as human beings, we are not built to shut down only negative emotions. It's like a breaker switch in the basement of a home. Either the whole thing is on or the whole thing is off. Numbness cuts the power to the whole house, not just the room where sadness is. So survivors who experience numbness often experience a diminished capacity for joy, for fulfillment, for excitement, and for giving and receiving love. The depression many survivors feel in the aftermath of the harm they survive is not just about the presence of sadness. It is also about the inaccessibility of joy. Numbness is often a factor in making the joy unavailable. Despite the vast odds stacked in favor of cycles of violence, it is essential to remember that most people who experience violence do not pass it along to others. But minimization also increases the risk of a survivor passing that harm on to others, in part because it can diminish a survivor's sense of the seriousness of the harm they are causing. Once we determine that something is not a big deal, it becomes something we can justify doing to each other. Many people who commit violence do so only after having developed a decreased sense of its seriousness. Some of that response has to do with individual experiences of surviving harm and minimizing the pain. But a decreased sense of violence's seriousness is never entirely individual. It is also cultural. The coping strategies available to people are socially determined, and the choices survivors make reflect society's overall regard or disregard for their pain. When we look for the underlying source of the normalization of violence, we cannot look at just one person's trajectory. A person does not make something normal. Only a culture can do that. And when it comes to violence, our culture has firmly established it as our American way of life. Making violence normal is always entangled with inequity. It is fairly straightforward to see the ways in which the normalization of violence sustains such inequity. Brutality on plantations has to be normalized by those in power for slavery to persist. Domestic violence has to be considered commonplace for people to stay in homes where they are beaten and controlled. Police violence has to be rendered as standard practice to enable the broad and brutal criminalization and punishment of whole communities, and so on. What is perhaps less obvious and less central to our public discourse is the way the normalization of violence not only generates and secures inequity, but depends on it. A society cannot normalize violence entirely. Its people cannot say that anyone can hurt anyone else at any time. They could say that no one can ever hurt anyone, though we don't say that in America. Rather, as sociologist and criminologist Nils Christie grapples with in his scholarship, our society says that some people can hurt other people some of the time for certain reasons. The function of a society is in no small part the containment of violence. The state reserves its right, to the exclusion of others' rights, to commit certain violence. In theory, this authority is meant to replace vigilante justice, for instance, with police and courts and prisons, so as to protect a society from individualized, unpredictable, uncontained violence. The problem with that frame is in this country is, first, that the government is responsible for a great deal of violence that exceeds the permissions legitimately granted to it. by the people, and second, that our culture continues to tolerate, condone, and even celebrate a wide range of violence committed by people other than their government. The only way to defend that arrangement is to tell a story. And by a story, I mean 1,000 stories told over and over again for centuries about the people against whom violence is being committed, a story that explains why the violence they sustained is acceptable, and even more important, why others should still feel safe in a world where people are being harmed. These stories always fall along fault lines of power, race, gender, and gender identity, sexuality, national origin, and other dimensions of identity that enable us to explain why certain violence has a place in our otherwise allegedly safe and moral nation. In a country where we were all truly equal, danger to another person would mean I am at risk. It is only in a place where we are unequal that danger to another person can be irrelevant to me or even protective. The problem for people on the receiving end of oppression is obvious. The framework allows for unthinkable harm to go unaddressed. But even for those of us in positions of greater privilege, this normalization has consequences. Once our story is no longer violence is wrong and it matters every time, but violence is sometimes wrong and that sometimes matters, then even those of us who co-signed and benefited from one form of inequity and the violence it generated can all too easily find ourselves on the wrong side of the power line, faced with violence that our culture will not say is wrong. In that way, there can be no lasting safety for anyone in a society that has inequity at its core. Which I feel that too, because it's saying, like, before May 30th, I had never been arrested or really brutalized by the police. I was in a protest in Chicago once, but it was real fleeting. But it wasn't until I really stood up to for Black Lives on May 30th that it was deemed that I became on the wrong side of the power line. And once that violence was done to me, society said that I deserved it. And I heard it hundreds of times last summer during our protests. We would talk to people, and I would talk to people, and I would tell them I was brutalized. People would say I deserved it. Flat out, over and over again. When I was 6, I was playing with my pet turtle, Hayun, he said, and I was all of a sudden surrounded by our neighborhood teens, she continued. They were a bunch of poor white kids who didn't have any other outlet. We lived in a really poor town. We were one of the only folks of color in our community back at the time. They had their hands on my underwear, and I didn't know what they wanted. I was confused. I was scared. When you are a kid and you have strangers violating you for no reason, it's confusing. It's scary. When I look back, I don't know if the police would have believed me. A group of white kids, a little Asian kid, who are you going to believe? A lot of what's available to survivors is tailored to white women. A lot of the public narrative about who a survivor is white women. And when you're not a white woman, you think that I don't get to be a survivor. I don't get to access those resources. They're not for me. Whether based in human dignity or sexism, or a little both, mainstream American culture has a robust narrative about the importance of protecting women. But when America talks about women, we are usually talking about white women and cisgender straight, middle-class white women at that. Contrary to this dominant narrative, however, the range of people who are harmed by crime is vast, including women of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, young men of color, LGBTQ people, and the working poor. Of course, many survivors belong to more than one of these groups, and for most, their victimization happens in a larger context of structural inequity, poverty, and disenfranchisement. This context means that the newest trauma is likely to amplify previous traumas, exacerbating the impact and making healing more complicated and elusive. Women of color live at this intersection, and they survive violence, including homicide, at extraordinarily high rates. These disparities are even greater for queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people who suffer homicide with extraordinarily high and often greatly underestimated frequency. But despite the relative erasure of these murders in comparison to the murder of white people, homicide is actually the most visible kind of violence. Other non-fatal forms of violence are all too often hidden from view, and their history is long and their prevalence vast, ranging from the legacy of sexual violence and genocide against Native women to the trafficking of women from Asian and other countries, violence against immigrant women attempting to cross the U.S. border, neighborhood-based violence, and brutality in this country's prisons. The violence women of color experience is far-reaching and often entwined with the very symptoms that are supposed to protect people from harm. Women of color are also more likely than their white counterparts to survive intimate partner violence. An estimated 29% of black women report experiencing this type of violence in their lifetime, including rape, physical assault, and stalking. But when they are harmed, they are less likely than white women to receive the support of social services, battered women's programs, or hospitals. This violence is not, of course, limited to black women. Studies show that Asian and Pacific Islander women, Latino women, Native women, and countless other women of color experience inordinate levels of violence, and across cultures, trans women experience intimate partner violence at unusually high rates. These trends also hold true for sexual violence. Women of color are disproportionately likely to be survivors of rape. Formidable work by thousands of women over the spans of decades has ensured that there are formal services for women who survive violence, particularly sexual assault and domestic violence. Still, women of color, even those who built and sustain those services, experience significant disparities in accessing them. Some of the barriers to access arise from our dominant narrative. Too often we do not tell women of color stories at all. When we do tell them, we do so in a distorted way, regularly portraying women of color as uncommonly or even superhumanly resilient, so to the point of obscuring their vulnerability and diminishing their need for care. This narrative is central to locking in our disregard for women of color's pain. It is designed to excuse us from the obligation we would otherwise have to fulfill if we were to contend fully with the impact of violence on women of color's lives. For women of color, their access to support in the aftermath of violence is also diminished by the same structural factors that made the violence likely in the first place. The pathways to healing and protection for women of color are limited by bias against them, and when the people who harm them are men of color against these men. The Women of Color Network describes the pattern. Non-arrests of suspected abusers of African American women and a fear that police will exercise an abuse of power have contributed to African American women's reluctance to involve law enforcement. Stereotypes amplify the complexities African American women encounter when trying to seek help services. Myths that African American women are domineering figures that require control, or that African American women are exceptionally strong under stress and are resilient, increase their vulnerability and discourage some from speaking out about abuse. I was reminded during that passage about when Officer Demke, or I forget his last name, one of the Rockford police officers, was asked about the violence used on black women at city market protests. He said that these women were exceptionally strong, and that it required that violence to subdue them. These women's vulnerability to harm therefore results not only from the people who commit violence against them, but from the failure of the systems that are supposed to protect them to acknowledge their pain and to see them as fully human and deserving care. This is not a new insight. Countless scholars and leaders who are women of color have been teaching these lessons for decades, and we would do well to hear and heed them. As Andrea Ritchie, author of Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, said in an interview, "We think of police as being there to protect the vulnerable or protect people who are targeted by violence. If you show police officers consistently where black women, women of color, or LGBT people of color are concerned, ignoring violence, telling people that they deserve what happened, assuming that they're a threat, that they committed the violence, or perpetrating violence against them, then the myth that they're about protecting victims of violence or vulnerable people starts to unravel. And we get a clearer picture that actually they don't change their stripes when they're responding with violence. They're still policing race, they're still policing gender, they're still policing sexuality, they're still policing poverty, they're seeing victims of violence who are outside of a very small group of middle-class white women who are not trans, are not deserving of protection. Not only do police too often fail to protect women of color, they are also likely to cause them harm. Although black women are routinely killed, raped, and beaten by the police, their experiences are rarely foregrounded in popular understandings of police brutality, writes Kimberly Crenshaw, director of Columbia Law School Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies. She continues, inclusion of black women's experiences in social movements, media narratives, and policy demands around policing and police brutality is critical to effectively combating racialized state violence for black communities and other communities of color. It is in part for this same reason that the group Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, concludes that strategies designed to combat violence within communities must be linked to strategies that combat violence directed against communities. It is only when we treat interpersonal and structural violence as related that we will develop solutions that work for people who live at the intersections of the two. Such integrated approaches are especially critical when both the people harmed and the people causing harm have little or no basis for trusting law enforcement. When the people who harm women of color are men of color, for example, the broader context of white supremacy sets a trap. Women of color are placed in the nearly impossible situation of seeking regard for pain caused to them by people whose pain they know has also been disregarded. It might seem to some that our broader culture's indifference to the pain experienced by men of color would mean that it would hold the men unequivocally accountable when they cause pain to women of color. But this doesn't happen. To the contrary, the disregard of men of color's pain only tightens the constraints around safety and healing for women of color, cutting off pathways to the transformation of harm. Self-identified healer and alchemist Fatima Mohammed has described her experience. As a little girl, I adored my father. Our time together was full of games we'd invent, and his affirmations that I was valuable to him and the world. And I saw my father beat my mother. I saw him caked in blood following bad drug deals. I witnessed in horror as the police barged into our home and took him away in handcuffs. For 20 years, there was a vast silence between us, held tight by the criminal justice system. Restraining orders, my father's ongoing spells of prison time, and a belief fortified by the world that this black man could only ever do me harm. I had no access to him, and no access to the part of myself that longed to be connected to him. In my 20s, I decided to find my father to release the anger, fear, and grief. In my healing journey with my father, a journey we leapt into immediately and with deep urgency, he confessed stories of the harm he had done to me, my brother, my mother, and others. I also learned about my father's recovery from addiction, his faith, and his own childhood abuse. And though my mother never saw or spoke to him directly, she accepted a gift he sent her, and accepted it with laughter. People of color carry the impossible burden of transgenerational structural harm alongside transgenerational interpersonal harm. The labor women of color toil through in these realities is glorified and vilified without ever being understood, offloaded, resourced, or elevated accurately. Who but us carries the work of redemption and healing for our loved ones who have harmed us? Who but us breathes through layers of unspeakable trauma only to get crushed by systems that render our full experience invisible? Who but us can testify that these systems that never give us the support or resources we deserve to heal, rest, and harness our power to actualize new visions for us, for our loved ones, for our communities? Excuse me for a minute, I'm going to get warmer. Alright, it's a little better. Our failure to address the harm women of color survive has to be understood both as its own independent wrongdoing requiring repair and simultaneously as inextricably intertwined with our failure to address the harm men of color survive. This second failure often begins in a denial of the possibility that men of color's pain even exists. Daquan was shot at in a public park by someone he knew. It was broad daylight. He was playing basketball. He looked up and saw a friend he had had an argument with approaching him. Then he saw the gun and saw it fire. His friend missed. He ran for his life across 4 lanes of traffic and eventually, after much hesitation and consideration, decided to report the crime to the police. When he did, he told the officer, "I was shot at in the park. My baby sister was there, and I don't know where she is, and I know who did it. The officer's response, "Where's your gun?" DeQuan paused in silence. The officer added, "Well, he didn't shoot at you for nothing." Our culture's denial of the pain of men of color experience shows up in the widespread portrayals of them as violent, but almost never as survivors of harm. A robust body of research documents the distorted representation of black men in the media. This includes underrepresentation overall. They are simply not shown. The exaggeration of negative associations, including criminality, unemployment, poverty, and violence, when they are visible. Limited positive associations, for instance, seeing successful black men only when they are sports heroes, not when they are businessmen or fathers, and the decontextualization of the challenges they face. For example, the problem of violence in Chicago being told without the historical context of redlining that helped create it. The decontextualization is an important dimension of the distortion of public images of black men, and includes erasing how the lives of black men and boys are affected by larger contexts, such as historical antecedents of black economic disadvantage, persistence of anti-black male bias, and relative disconnection from the social networks that help create wealth and opportunity. This decontextualization can also exacerbate bias and blame. As the Social Justice Communication Lab Opportunity Agenda contends in its report on the subject, public perceptions and attitudes toward black males not only help to create barriers to advancement within the society, but also make that seem natural or inevitable. When it comes to violence, black men are overrepresented as people who perpetuate violent crime, and this is made especially clear when news coverage is compared with arrest rates, but are underrepresented in portrayals and coverage of crime victims, despite the extraordinary rates at which they survive harm. Although young men of all races from age 16 to 24 experience higher rates of violence than any other age group, including assaults and robbery, data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics at the U.S. Department of Justice consistently show that young black men are among the most likely to be victimized by violence overall. For young men of color, this violence is also more likely to include homicide. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, homicide is the leading cause of death for young black males ages 10 to 24. The impact of this disparity can be especially acute in urban settings where homicide is more common. In New York City, for example, in the first half of 2012, 96% of shooting victims, fatal and non-fatal, were black or Latino. The exaggeration in our culture's narrative about the harm caused by men of color is a central element in normalizing this violence. As black men's overstated criminality becomes justification for sanctioning violence against them, blaming them for their own victimization, not investing in victim services to tend to their pain, and presuming that their childhood exposure to violence was part of a socialization process that just made them harder and more violent, rather than understanding that process as something that might have harmed or hurt them. Even stories that are explicitly about the victimization of young men of color reinforce the narrative about their presumed criminality. Montgomery's latest homicide victim had a history of narcotics abuse, tangles with the law, and Trayvon Martin was suspended 3 times from school, and police slain Lakeland teen had been shot before. death possibly drug-related, and shooting victim had many run-ins with law, and police warned shooting victim was gang member, or this. After Otis Bird was found hanging from a tree in Mississippi in what many feared was a lynching, CNN noted that he'd been convicted of murder 35 years previously. His death later was ruled a suicide. It is difficult, for instance, to find a single news piece about a young man of color who was killed that does not also include information about his criminal record, whether he had been arrested 7 times or he had never been arrested. The former is supposed to tell us that this person in some way had it coming, as if having been arrested is justification for having been murdered. The latter is supposed to signal that the person we lost is an outlier, one of the good ones, and is meant to animate our empathy we would not be called on to access were that person less innocent. Reporting on the criminal history or lack thereof of young men of color has become so normalized that a story is considered incomplete until the last piece of information is shared. It is the conclusion really, and is in the central content that is meant to guide the meaning we make of the news. But of course this reporting is not normalized for everyone. If I, a white woman, were killed, it is nearly unthinkable that the report about my death would end with, "She had no criminal record." People would regard that line as irrelevant at best, callous and disrespectful at worst, and they would be right. The problem is, it is just as outrageous and just as wrong in a story about a young man of color. Our attachment to innocence, as measured incoherently by a person's lack of criminal history, interferes with our ability to uphold basic values as a culture, most simply that violence is wrong and that it matters every single time. We've seen this used against Tyrus Jones. They criminalized him and said that he did all this stuff and charged him with, crimes and made it all about that, and not that he was shot in the back while running away by police. We're at the ongoing teach-in at Say Their Name Square. We're reading Until We Reckon by Danielle Sered. We're on page 213. If a police officer tells a young man he didn't shoot you for nothing, how are we to ask this survivor to believe that the violence against him is not normal when the officers do not ask him how he is, do not tell him what happened to him was wrong, do not promise him protection and care, and instead say directly that he must have had it coming? How can we ask him to place his trust in the same police to secure his safety going forward? And how dare we tell a story about that young man's diminished sense of the seriousness of violence without including the larger structural context as a core cause? Just as the larger narrative shaped the police's response to this young man, so too do they shape the young man's response to what the officer said. People of color, as the opportunity agenda describes, draw on far more experience than others to form images of themselves and their peers. But they are also members of the public, and they are not immune to the influence of the media, which they consume just as other Americans do. It is one thing to persuade white people that violence against people of color is normal and justified. It is harder and arguably more insidious thing to persuade people of color of the same thing. In that sense, the fact that black people can also underestimate black people's capacity to feel pain is also the direct result of structural racism. The audiences for the white historical message that violence against black people is normal includes not only white people but black people too. So the fact that some black people have internalized any or all of that message is not evidence of its race neutrality, but to the contrary of its far-reaching and heart-wrenching impact. I think all the time about Victor, a survivor of a serious assault. He was beaten terribly, stripped of all his clothes down to his boxers, and left in the middle of the street in the heart of winter. Lying in his own... Okay, I'll start that over because I had to... Somebody's walking by talking. He was beaten terribly, stripped of all his clothes down to his boxers, and left in the middle of the street in the heart of winter, lying in his own blood. When he told me the story, he concluded it by saying, "I was almost a victim." What he meant, of course, is that he almost died that night. That a victim isn't someone who was hurt. A victim is a dead body, a chalk outline on the cold street. That anything short of death was just more or less a normal part of life. That the only time a young man like him could get the victim label, for better or worse, was if he had died on the ground that day instead of eventually regaining consciousness and standing back up. Victor didn't invent that story about the insignificance of his pain. His country did. And the story he is carrying is as old as this country. Like all of our narratives, when they are retold often enough in enough ways, we internalize them to the point that they overcome even our most elemental experiences of excruciating physical pain. The classic experiment in which young children were given a choice between a black doll and a white one, which ends, as we know to expect, with most children, including most black children, choosing the white one as more beautiful, is but one of countless examples of how early we are taught to value certain lives over others. It is on top of that belief system that we overlay our stories of violence and healing. The old framework about who can and can't be hurt in America is in our bones, and it constrains not just our understanding and decision-making, but even our ability to experience and make sense of our pain. Of course, Victor was not an outlier. When I asked a group of 10 young men of color coming home from Rikers Island, "How many of you have been victims of crime?" No hands went up, not one. When I asked, how many of you have had something taken from you by force?" 8 hands went up. How many of you have had something stolen from your home? 10 hands. How many of you have ever lost a fight and been hurt or been jumped? 9 of the 10 young men raised their hand. Yet none had been the victim of crime. The distinction in their answers is not just about language. It is also about history, in the way we have defined not merely whose victimization matters, but whose victimization exists in the first place. For these young men, the racialized denial of black people's susceptibility to pain is compounded by widespread cultural norms about masculinity. All too often, manhood is equated with toughness, and toughness is equated with invulnerability and imperviousness to pain. We raise men, in particular, to be fearless and unfazed by what they endure. Indeed, we consider many of these qualities to be benchmarks of boys reaching manhood. These norms shape a man's sense of himself and constrict what forms of feeling and expression are available to him. Men are known to be less likely to acknowledge being in emotional or physical pain, less likely to use certain subjective language, words like hurt or sad, in describing how they feel, and less likely to seek help when they are hurt. It becomes too easy as a society to believe that those things are okay, because these men often seem, as they say they are, fine. When limited notions of masculinity unite with a racist and racialized narrative stressing that some victims feel pain less profoundly than others, the combination is toxic and results in a near complete erasure of what would otherwise be our societal obligation to regard, care for, and help heal those wounds. Similarly, the same narrow conceptions of masculinity fuel homophobia and amplify the harm, including assault and sexual violence done to gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and gender nonconforming men of color who live at the intersection of these biases. Finally, when men of color are denied access to healing, their roles as healers and caretakers are often compromised. When their unhealed pain manifests as isolation, addiction, or violence, men who have survived violence are often less able to see and tend to the pain of the men and women and children who love them. When that happens, the people who love them also lose what they need and deserve to heal and be safe. Well, that's heavy. Oh, thanks for liking my blanket, Tyler. Yeah, that was heavy. I don't even know what to say about that. You know, patriarchy, sucks. Making men feel like they can't, you know, show their pain, feel pain. And then how it intersects with men of color, and how that steamrolls into generational violence, and all takes place in Rockford. All of this talking about, you know, of course it does, happens everywhere, but of course this is in Rockford. And illustrates a part of the problem of policing in Rockford, and how we treat young black men in Rockford. I'm just gonna go on. So, two distinct things are simultaneously true. Violence and mass incarceration disproportionately impact people of color, and violence and mass incarceration devastate the lives of white people. Having talked about the first reality, it is important to talk about the second, noting definitively that nothing about acknowledging the pain white people endure diminishes the reality of the racial inequities at hand or alleviates our obligation to correct them. A full exploration of white culture and its relationship to violence and punishment is a necessary project, but beyond the scope of this book. Still, we cannot talk about violence without talking explicitly about white people and our connections to violence. We do not typically have this conversation. As a nation, when we talk about violence, we talk a great deal about harm that people of color commit against each other, talk disproportionately about the far rarer occasions when people of color commit violence against white people, and sometimes even talk about violence white people commit against people of color. But we rarely talk about the daily violence within white communities. This exclusion is problematic because it feeds the notion that violence is a black problem, but also because it obscures the way many white communities across the country suffer from the traumatic interplay of violence and poverty. By downplaying or ignoring pain in white communities, we block pathways to advance equity and to develop strategies that can reduce and tend to that pain. Similarly, our conversations about incarceration rarely include discussion of its impact on white people. The extraordinary disproportionality of people of color who are imprisoned has to be central to our understanding of mass incarceration in our culture and what it will take to end it. But the fact that the criminal justice system is inequitable and has roots in a history of structural racism has never meant that white people are fully protected from its damaging effects. Although white people overall have a greater expectation of access to and fairness in the justice system, they are not insulated from its detrimental impacts, nor have they been immune to its exponential growth over the past 4 decades. In fact, white people make up 39% of those incarcerated, close to 1 million people on any given day. In Ohio, for instance, white people represented the fastest growing group entering prison in 2013. 80% of women entering the state's prisons that year were white. A recent report by the Vera Institute of Justice found that while the use of jail and prison is declining in many urban centers, rural jails in largely white communities have the highest rates of growth in pretrial detention in the country. Pretrial detention rates in those counties increased a full 436% from 1970 to 2013. White people are not insulated from other forms of violence either. Working class and poor white communities in particular are beset with violence, intimate partner violence, and domestic violence that are rampant in many communities and exacerbated by high rates of unemployment, physical and sexual abuse of children, which data have always shown no boundary of race, gender, or class. Disputes over property, relationships, and honor that escalate to violence. Violence related to illegal drug markets and bar fights, street fights, assaults, and murder. In white communities with neither wealth nor a strong social safety net, this violence does just what it does in communities of color. It initiates or perpetuates cycles of retaliatory violence, engenders or intensifies unhealthy substance use, tears families apart, and when unhealed, results in lasting trauma that is passed down over generations. Just as violence in our communities of color intersects with our culture's stories about whose lives are valued and whose are not, so too does violence in white communities reflect a bigger story about power. Interpersonal violence is always shaped by the larger context in which it happens. And the larger context in America has always been both a story that all white people are better than people of color, especially black people, and a story that some white people are the least valuable of their kind. We see these interlocked and competing stories in the ways white people behave in our own families and communities, in the painful and often harmful ways we attempt to resolve the tensions between the notion that we are better than everyone else and the constant evidence that we are imperfect, flawed, and sometimes terribly wrong. Because culture is persistent, the same characteristics of white culture that manifest in our historical and continued destructive treatment of people of color are also visible in the ways white people treat one another in our own communities, our own relationships, in our own homes. White culture is characterized by behavior meant to control, punish, exile, and exterminate. It is useful to say aloud that these patterns are real, and that they have become part of who and how we white people are in the world. It is only then that we will stand a chance at changing them. White people control people. We want people to behave a certain way, and we use power to try to ensure that they do so. In our own families and relationships and communities, we police behavior we regard as aberrant, as embarrassing, as strange, as improper, as rebellious, as imperfect, as somehow inconsistent with our supposed superiority, and we try to stop that behavior. To do so, we use incentives. We give or withhold money. We give or withhold love. We call on notions of loyalty and family and belonging. We embarrass people. We talk about people. We deceive people. We apply threats. And we use overt threats, threats of exclusion, of deprivation, of violence, and of shame. When we do not succeed in controlling people, we punish people. We withdraw support, withdraw love, withdraw resources, withdraw access. We discipline, we insult, we demean, we humiliate, we beat, we burn, we injure, we violate, we abuse, we wound, we shame. And when punishment does not work, we exile, we throw people away, our very own white trash. We disown people, kick them out of our homes, our families, our communities. We deny our ties to them, deny our history with them, deny our part in them, and who they are and what they do. We refuse their calls, block their access, block their numbers, block their names from our lips and our memory. We change the passwords, change the story, change the locks. And when even exile fails to remedy the perceived threat to who we think we are, we exterminate, we kill, and kill, and kill. This way of being is a recipe for mass incarceration. It is no coincidence that the criminal justice system white people built has four main functions: control, in the form of policing; punishment, in forms ranging from fines to imprisonment; exile, in the form of incarceration; and extermination, in the form of executions. But this way of being is also a recipe for violence. It assumes that behavior is shaped by power and control rather than connection and responsibility. And all the way through, it is anchored in shame, by the avoidance, threat, and experience of shame, and the most reliable driver of violence around. Many white people, particularly those who are poor and working class, have experienced the cruelty and inhumanity of these functions of white culture, even as they have benefited from the advantages that accompany it. They have been punished or exiled from their families, their churches, and their communities for their behavior or the behavior of their loved ones, their criminal convictions, their addictions, their mental illness, their violence, and their mistakes. Most people in working class and poor white communities have experienced harms that are connected to this culture, precisely because of how damaging the current socioeconomic structure is for them. Plenty of middle class and even wealthy white people have also endured these harms, which include addiction, physical and sexual abuse, domestic violence, other forms of violence, and loss. Trauma like this can have an ossifying effect. It can solidify our beliefs beyond intervention. It can narrow the range of people we trust and listen to, and it can create an appetite for a channel for our anger that, when coupled with those other effects, can be disastrous. Combine that trauma with a story that we are superior, and whether we are rich or poor or somewhere in between, the combination can make us behave in hateful ways to the people closest to us, and in horrific ways to those we regard as other or less than us. We could end this kind of violence in white communities, or at least render it no longer normal, if we wanted to, just as we could end the high levels of incarceration everywhere. One way for us to do so would be by using even a fraction of the resources we currently spend on incarcerating people of color. If we did not allocate spending as we do, we could, not just for white people, but for everyone, equitably restore cuts to Medicaid and Medicare, build functional schools, invest in economic development programs that gave people a pathway to a dignified living wage, close the gap in access to healthy, affordable food, or fix our roads and bridges and community centers and hospitals in all communities. But none of that has been our priority. Prisons have been, especially but not only prisons for people of color. Some of that is because our culture has made the control of people of color such a central piece of who we are as Americans. That control is one way we enact the story that all white people are better than people of color, especially black people. This story is not just about overt racism. It is not just about the hate groups whose presence has endured through every phase of progress towards racial justice and whose visible resurgence we have witnessed in recent years. While it is in part about the overt belief in white people's superiority, it is not just a set of beliefs, and it is not always overt. It is also, and most often, what those beliefs look like woven into our unconscious thinking, our behavior, and our institutions. It is the scaffolding around the culture we built. Even when it is no longer visible, it remains part of how the thing was made. But that racism alone is not enough to have driven our lifeless prioritization of incarceration over the larger social good. We have also had to enact the other parallel story, the one that teaches that some white people are the least valuable of their kind, that some are no more than trash. This notion of white trash is as least as old as our country, and it separates a portion of our nation's people from the rest, exaggerates their criminality, accuses them of laziness even as it exploits their labor, and asserts the disposability of their lives. This story is not contradictory to the larger story of white supremacy. It is a part of it. It is the soft, ugly underbelly that aims to explain a world where white people are allegedly, innately superior, and yet so many of them have so little of what they need. It at once drives comparably less advantaged white people's investment in being superior to people of color and ensures their relative position in the hierarchy below wealthier white people, and it causes pain, because the desperate grasp for dominance and the experience of relative powerlessness are both catalysts of violence. There is no pathway out of mass incarceration that does not require dismantling and displacing a structure like this. And we will not end violence, not just against and among people of color, but against and among white people too. Without addressing head-on these stories and their far-reaching manifestations in our culture, this work will prove to be non-negotiable element of any road to repair. How then do we reverse the normalization of violence, the disregard and distortion of the pain people of color experience is not just a gap in empathy, nor will it be solved by an increase in empathy alone. It is most centrally about power. Like the individual healing process, such a societal effort requires regarding violence seriously and situating both the pain and the response to it in its social and historical context. And also like that individual process, it requires realigning power. To do so, first we have to tell a different story. We have to insist that the pain of women and trans people of color is spoken and heard, resist the narratives that render them as superhuman to the point of being impervious to pain, and insist that their pain is our collective responsibility to help heal. We have to push back against the narrative that the pain young men of color experience is insignificant, that it is somehow more tolerable than the harm others experience, that they are all involved in gangs anyway, that they are accustomed to violence as a way of resolving disputes, that they do not feel pain quite in the way other people do, that they are untrustworthy narrators of their own experience, and insist on the simpler and clearer story that they are people, many of them children, and that they hurt when they are harmed. We have to resist the old deadly stories to make space for new ones, but shifting this narrative requires stories that are not just simply newer, but more complete, stories like the ones many people of color have been telling for centuries. It requires acknowledging the legacy of slavery when we talk about the record-setting homicide rates on the south side of Chicago. It requires acknowledging the impact of redlining when we talk about gang-related violence in Detroit. It requires an immediate end to the mainstream journalism practice of always reporting about a young man of color's criminal record if he is shot. It requires recognizing the distortions our mass media perpetrate anytime we talk about women of color and correcting those distortions. It also requires not just talking about pain, but tending to it, mourning and grieving it, and working to end it. In April of 2018, under the leadership of one of my personal heroes, Brian Stevenson, the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, in Alabama opened the nation's first national memorial for peace and justice, dedicated to the legacy of enslaved black people, people terrorized by lynching, African Americans humiliated by racial segregation and Jim Crow, and people of color burdened with contemporary presumptions of guilt and police violence. This memorial grew out of EJI's work documenting incidents of lynching in America, an undertaking that always aimed to create and correct the historical record and understand the terror and trauma that sanctioned violence against the black community created. In this work, EJI staff and volunteers have visited hundreds of lynching sites where they have collected soil, which is then displayed at the memorial, and created public memorials that aim to displace our culture of denial with one of truth and repair. Set on top of a hill in Montgomery with the hot Alabama sun blazing down on row after row after row of hanging markers raised to each person known to have been lynched in this country, the memorial is gut-wrenchingly solemn and is its argument undeniable. It tells a whole truth. EJI understands the acknowledgement, recognition, and memory of mass atrocities and abuse as a prerequisite for a society's recovery from such violence. This kind of sacred practice reflects the deep wisdom that the work of healing from our legacy of violence and fostering a future in which something else is possible must include, in part, the work of grief and mourning that such public acknowledgement not just allows but requires. Erica Bridgeford brings this work of sacred grief to present-day violence. Bridgeford lives in Baltimore, where she has emerged as a leader in her city's struggle against homicide. She works from the understanding that Baltimore's violence not only produces pain, but is the product of it. And the only way out is through healing. Bridgeford began visiting the scene of every homicide in the city to grieve, to honor those lost, and to reclaim the space. She speaks of the imprint violence leaves on a place and the power of transforming that through acknowledgement and love. Her work combats the disregard that lies at the heart of the normalization of violence, and in making this healing public, contributes to shifting what is and can be normal. Once lesser known features of the work of Cure Violence, a program with sites all over the country, embodies the kind of spirit Bridgeford teaches. Every time someone is shot in an area where Cure Violence works, they hold a small street memorial and put up one of the makeshift altars with signs and candles and teddy bears that are all too familiar to people who live in neighborhoods where killings are common. They do this if the person was a bystander killed in a drive-by shooting, but they also do this if the person was a known gang member with a history of violent crime. This practice mirrors practices in neighborhoods across the country where community members expand the work of grief to include everyone. Combating the normalization, while I was thinking that, I thought, why don't we do that in Rockford? We certainly need it. There's intersections in Rockford that have shootings at alarming rates. Maybe if there was more work done around those places, it could be acknowledged that some of these places have recurring acts of violence. Combating the normalization of violence is not just about grieving the lives we are already culturally primed to grieve. It is about the harder work of greeting every life lost, of saying no matter who you are, no matter what you have done, no matter how angry or afraid we are, we will still say that what happened to you was wrong. We do not believe that you are deserving of. We will still say that what happened to you was wrong. We do not believe that you are deserving of violence. We believe your life remains sacred, and we will grieve you because you are one of us. That does not mean we excuse whatever harm the person may have committed. It just means that we do not excuse the harm committed against them. These efforts all recognize the interplay between collective and individual healing. When we treat violence like an individual problem, absent its larger context, the solutions we envision are individualistic. When we understand violence in the context of society and history, then healing takes a different form. It continues to include the intimate personal process of coming through specific acts of harm, but it also requires fostering a context that acknowledges and transforms the realities that made that harm likely. Healing Works, a national field and movement building project committed to securing healing equity, includes as one of its central tenets for an individual healing, addressing racial trauma head-on. In years of listening to practitioners across the country about what helps people move through pain, over and over again, these and other organizations have learned that situating pain in its larger context is essential to its transformation. Trauma has no respect for boundaries. New pain does not behave as separate from old pain, however much we might like to measure and treat it as such. In that way, the work of collective mourning is the work of individual grieving and vice versa. And the work of grieving is always the work of reopening the possibility of imagination. If healing is in part the struggle to wrest a future from a painful past, then it is also includes the work of resistance. This includes developing new ways of thinking that make internalized oppression visible for what it is and offer strategies to disentangle from its nets. It includes movement anthems, affirmations, and as some say them, prayers, like Black is Beautiful and Black Lives Matter, which insist over and over again on the fundamental truths that racism denies. It includes jazz and blues and hip-hop and other forms of truth-telling in the larger culture war at hand. It includes comedy and the kind of laughter that brings us to the edge of weeping, to the place where joy and grief reconnect. It includes food and stories and the reclamation of rituals that were never supposed to survive and whose survival includes the promise of other survivals, including one's own. And it includes building power through organizing. Dr. Anna Ortega Williams' groundbreaking 2018 dissertation asks in its title, "Is organizing a pathway for well-being and post-traumatic growth for Black youth in New York City?" and traces the ways in which the work of building power can support young people in recovering from historical trauma and systemic violence. Ortega Williams' research finds that the act of resistance of working to address harm and create change can help young people transform traumatic experiences into ones that foster healing, growth, and power. As she implores people investing in supporting Black youth's healing, emphasize trauma recovering practices that take into account mass group trauma, intergenerational trauma responses, post-traumatic growth through action, as well as the acknowledgement of their inheritance of historical resistance. Inquire into the narratives that fuel them, that shape their identities. Recognize ancestors that strengthen them and explore what a healed Black future means to them. Support them in alchemic translation of their lived experiences so they can use it as an indictment for systemic accountability and healing through working for social justice. This almost surely holds true not only for Black youth, but for so many people of color and other survivors who take on the nearly, yes, only nearly, impossible task of transforming pain. And it is worth it. Healing is, as one survivor described it to me, no joke. When people heal, the options foreclosed by trauma begin to reopen. Healed people have the experience of change, of going from pain to some measure of relief. Healed people are nimble. Healed people are often suspicious of belief systems that deny change, because the fact that they are still alive is because they were capable of change. Healed people are less susceptible to manipulation and less in need of toxic forms of protection. Healed people have a harder time being indifferent to other people's pain and often see themselves and others who have come through loss. Healed people cannot be persuaded that violence is normal. Healed people heal people. In the context of the larger work of addressing this nation's historical and racialized trauma, these outcomes of healing will manifest in their own way for white people too, for whom the combination of white supremacy and our own pain can harden into patterns of great harm to ourselves and others. Healing, then, is one of the ways white people will become capable of supporting a humane and rational response to harm, including the harm people of color endure, as well as the harm we ourselves endure, and of contributing to the disruption of our current deadening narratives that lock cycles of violence in place. What would it mean to envision and build not just a set of services, but an entire healing infrastructure in America? How can we create an interlocking system of institutions, resources, people, and practices that together support survivors to initiate, engage in, and secure healing over the long term and to prevent future harm? While building this infrastructure will require a realignment of priorities, funding, and cultural attitudes towards violence and recovery, it does not mean starting from scratch. To begin with, communities of color in this country would not still be here if they did not have within them measures to heal pain. The devastation across generations would be too vast. Rather, throughout the country, in these communities and elsewhere, people are already doing the work of healing harm. They are the GED teachers who grew up in the same neighborhoods where they stay late to talk to their students who have suffered losses. They are the local barbershop owners who create space where people can unload their pain and pick up strategies to cope with it. They are the school counselors who understand trauma and ask, "What happened to you?" before asking, "What's wrong with you?" When someone misbehaves in class, they are the violence interrupters who circle back around after an incident to talk to someone about his underlying pain. They are the women people call when someone is shot, women who can talk people out of retaliation, accompanying grieving mothers to the morgue, plan a vigil, and keep an eye on the kids who witnessed it. They are the mourners, the grievers, the caretakers, and the imaginers. These healing resources exist, but they tend to be vastly under-resourced, devalued relative to more traditional nonprofits, disregarded as providing legitimate victim services, and disconnected from one another in ways that create barriers to improving practice, commanding resources, and building movement. Because these practices and leaders exist, developing a healing infrastructure does not require inventing some new evidence-based practice and exporting it to cities across the country. To the contrary, it requires investing in these local, steadfast healing supports so that they can achieve the scale of change and relief they are poised to deliver with adequate resources, supporting people engaged in healing work, professionals and others, to develop and expand strategies that work, honoring culture, geography, and history, and embracing a wide range of healing strategies, including those that depart from standard white and or Western and or middle class and or professional modalities, nurturing the development of strategies that address racial trauma head-on and work to heal through intergenerational trauma, integrating healing as a core objective of major policy platforms, and ensuring that people who have survived harm and are healing through it shape the development and implementation of a healing agenda. The wide availability of these services will not just provide something, it will say something. It will convey that we believe what happened to those who are harmed is wrong, that their pain matters and that they are deserving of support and capable of healing. Institutions like these not only reflect social norms and values, but generate them. The existence of support conveys that violence is wrong and insignificant, that access to support is important, that people can and deserve to seek help, and that when people are harmed, we will hold them closer rather than isolate them in their pain. Those are the norms and values of a society that no longer regards violence as normal. Those are not yet norms we hold equally for all people. But expanding that type of infrastructure equitably is within our reach if we choose to do it. We also need to integrate a commitment to healing in other places where people make connections and access support, including schools, community programs, public housing, churches and mosques and other cultural hubs, job development programs, child care centers, and nursing homes. It requires viewing other social services within a framework of healing and adapting practices so as to support safety and recovery from harm. In our hospitals, it will mean not handcuffing people to their beds when they have been shot because we suspect them of having provoked their own near assassinations. In our schools, it will mean addressing students' trauma In our schools, it will mean addressing students' trauma individually and teaching collectively about the history that has produced our current systems and conditions. In our jails and prisons, it will mean that violence carried out against incarcerated people, whether by other incarcerated people or by staff, will no longer be tolerated, and that those responsible will be held accountable. Critically, the best healing strategies reflect a lesson that survivors have been sounding for decades, that healing is both broader and more varied than the criminal justice system, and even most mainstream victim service programs presume. Survivors want to live in safer neighborhoods, not just be kept safe from specific people. They want the resources to rebuild their lives. They want safe housing and the opportunity to meet their economic needs. They want to be able to protect and care for their families. They want for others what they want for themselves, to be safer, happier, and more whole. They want justice, but they do not always want justice in the forms that exist now. This means that our responses cannot be confined to addressing individual trauma, however broadly and creatively we might do so. We will also have to shift towards a broad prioritization of ending violence in our justice systems, in our distribution of resources, and in our culture. This will require reversing the structural drivers of violence, from denial to divestment to disempowerment, and in their place building living promises that reflect a belief that violence is wrong and always has been. In our economic policy, it will mean creating pathways to a living wage and upward mobility for everyone. In our housing policy, it will mean ensuring access to safe, stable, decent homes for everyone and reversing the inequities established by redlining and amplified by the mortgage crisis. In our civic policy, it will require taking a stand against impunity and holding institutions and government actors responsible for harm when they cause it. In our budgets, it will mean that healing will take priority over enforcement and equity over profit. It will require a substantial and long-lasting corrective redistribution of resources and the power to direct them. And in our criminal justice policy, it will mean using incarceration as the option of last resort that it always should have been. Ultimately, the development of a healing infrastructure will require building power to demand, create, and protect the kind of structures that truly produce well-being. Survivors, including those who are angry, those who are forgiving, those who are in pain, those who have begun to heal, those who want systemic change, those who have caused harm, and those whose voices we have not yet heard and elevated, can and will define the direction and priorities of any principled healing agenda. This will not be about charity, because trauma distills down to powerlessness. The opposite of trauma is not help. The opposite of trauma is power. Oh my gosh, that is so powerful. Got to read that again. Because trauma distills down to powerlessness, the opposite of trauma is not help. The opposite of trauma is power. It will therefore be essential that any reallocation of resources is not top-down, but grounded in an ever-increasing accountability on the part of government systems and community leaders to the political power built by those whose lives are at stake in violence and its elimination. That power will secure the services and resources necessary for healing, but it will also help people heal. This is where the process becomes iterative, because healed people are formidable. People who have come through pain are more capable of participating in an ongoing way in their communities, of organizing with one another, developing strategic policy agendas, and doing the work to ensure that those agendas are implemented. In that way, supporting survivors is not only of benefit to them, it is of benefit to our democracy, which will be strengthened by the full and robust participation by more of its members. In the end, it is only that changed democracy that will deliver the policy and practice we need. When we dig down through the dirt that is the normalization of violence in America down to the roots, we find it grows from inequity. The story that violence is normal depends on the story that some of us are more deserving of safety than others, and some are more deserving of pain. It depends on the story that some of us should just expect to be hurt, and that the rest of us bear no responsibility for that hurt. It depends on the story that some of us no longer even feel pain, if we ever did. It depends on a history awash with erasure, not just of violence, but of resistance to and healing from violence as well. It depends on stories of unworthiness, of numbness, of monstrosity, and of forgetting, and it depends on institutions that embody and enforce those stories. There is no way out of the normalization and institutionalization of violence without a massive cultural reorientation. In thinking about imagining our way to a culture that has inverted the normalization of violence, I asked a number of people I respect deeply how they would complete the sentence, "The opposite of violence is blank." The answers included compassion, harmony, patience. This one from the historian in the group. Dignity, safety, freedom, respect, mercy, honor, connection, and love. I think they are all right. The future healing promises is always related to the past in which it begins. Any road to a world in which violence is no longer normal, in which compassion and dignity and love define us instead, will therefore require steering head-on into the damage wrought by racism and the violence from which it originates, on which it relies, and which it protects. Whether or not we are up to that challenge may well be the central question of our generation. I am persuaded that it is, at the minimum, the question on which our ability to end both mass incarceration and violence depends. Facing the past raises another question. If the answer above described the opposite of violence in the present tense, what then is the opposite of violence that has already occurred? What is a corrective force equal and opposite to the violence we have done? In that sense, we might say the opposite of violence is healing. It is recovery. It is repair. But I would argue that it is something more than that, something that has the grace and weight of accountability in it as well. I would say that in the face of what we in this country have done, the opposite of violence is reckoning. Pow. So that was chapter 6, which was powerful, informative, enlightening, asking what the opposite of violence is, what past tense, the opposite of past tense violence is. Explaining how violence is not contained within an individual, that it's can't be solved through an individual strategy. That it comes from a larger cultural inequities, and how healing is empowering, and how we have to heal the greater society before we can really heal the individual, because it keeps perpetuating the violence in society, keeps perpetuating the individual's violence and the individual victimization of people. The connections to Rockford are, obvious. This is everywhere. This is in all of society. So of course it's in Rockford. We see this in the criminal justice system in Rockford. In the media in Rockford, everything. I'm going to keep going though. So I want to try to get through this last chapter. Got one more chapter. Our Reckoning, chapter 7. And then I'm going to take a break and eat something and get more organized about what we're going to do with the next rainstorm and when people start coming to work. So what do we do with what we have done? The scale of harm, both individual and structural, that we as a nation have committed is immense. Knowingly and unknowingly, honestly and dishonestly, we have crafted a story about violence and brought that story brutally to life in a new form. In incarceration, we have protected and exacerbated the core dimensions of slavery, woven and rewoven them into what could have been a changing story for our nation, entrenched them ever more deeply into our economy, and built our politics in service rather than opposition to the core myths, values, and practices that define structural racism. We have locked up our own people at a rate and scale unprecedented in human history, and generated unfathomable pain, some now beyond all healing, and some that will take generations to heal. We have built a culture of incarceration in a way that has devastated communities of color so disproportionately as to make the lineage from slavery through Jim Crow to our current jails and prisons undeniable. And yet, even with the extraordinary inequity, we have still not built it in a way that has protected white people, at least not all white people. We have sent millions upon millions of white people to jail and prison too, and we have failed to protect many white people, particularly poor white people, from the violence that incarceration is supposed to resolve. We have made clear that controlling and punishing people of color is more important than meeting the basic needs for food, housing, and medical care, not just for them, but for anyone. Our federal, state, and local budgets make it plain. If we look at cuts to Medicaid alongside our expanding investments in law enforcement and prisons, it is quite literally true that we will let poor people die so long as we can continue to finance our warped attachment to incarceration. At the same time that we have continually renewed our commitment to racism, we have simultaneously doubled down on the ethos of disposability at the heart of the term white trash, have capitalized on the unhealed pain in poor white communities, and have fostered racial division through propaganda, intimidation, and policy to ensure that the shared portion of this experience of oppression does not become the basis for collaborative interracial resistance and struggle. Communities of color suffer immensely as a result. Poor white communities do too, and while many middle-class and wealthy white people will profit from such division, the poor white people will pay for their racial loyalty will be greater in the end than the near-term benefits they are given for adherence. Being just one rung up from the bottom of the ladder of power is little security when the floodwaters rise. There is no way out of this without dealing with the past. We will have to face what we have done. We will have to face the people who have spent years of their lives in 6-by-9-foot boxes with virtually no human contact. We will have to face the millions of children who spent their mornings, bedtimes, birthdays, holidays, and childhoods with their parents separated from them in prison. We will have to face the hundreds of thousands of people who survived sexual violence in the jails and prisons where we sent them. We will have to face people's pain and night terrors and flashbacks and hypervigilance. And crucially, we will have to face all of the survivors and communities throughout this country to whom we promise safety as the reward for this devastation, and who did not become and still are not safe as a result. Their pain is our national harvest. We have championed incarceration with full knowledge of its unquestionable brutality, and we have expanded it in the face of clear and rising evidence of its failure to produce the results it promises. Since incarceration does not merely fail to reduce violence but generates violence, our investment in incarceration has been an investment in violence. We are on the hook as a society for answering for the pain this investment has produced, not only to those people who suffer its harms directly, but to those communities that have suffered at the losing end of the policy failure it represents. We can continue to put off correcting our course and answering for it, But the scale of harm is growing, and so too is what will be required of us to repair it. If by some small chance we have not already crossed the line into the terrain of the irreparable, we would be best off steering into our process of accounting for it now, while some transformation may still be within our reach. Acts of individual and structural harm are meaningfully different, but the key elements of accountability, acknowledging responsibility for one's actions, acknowledging the impact of one's actions on others, expressing genuine remorse, taking action to repair the harm to the degree possible, and no longer committing similar harm apply to both. Just as we ask people who cause interpersonal violence to reckon with their actions, so should we as a society call on ourselves to reckon too. Until we do, no different future will be possible. The first element of accountability begins with truth-telling. By acknowledging responsibility for our actions, we own our individual and collective roles and power in generating, supporting, or being complicit in the harm that has been caused both by mass incarceration and by our failure to develop effective solutions for violence. It means saying, we chose this, we had options, and this is what we did. The second element, acknowledging the impact of our actions and others, means saying, not only did we choose this, but these are the results of our choices. It means saying, even if we want to claim that we did not know the effects of mass incarceration would have, either individually as citizens, voters, lawmakers, or system actors, or more globally as an entire society, that we could have known, it was our responsibility to know, and we know now. It means giving up the protection of certain myths and lies deployed to make the choices we have made feel morally sound when they were anything but. It means giving up the security of feigned ignorance. It means truth-seeking, and it means being honest about what we find when we look at our present and our history. This is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, James Baldwin wrote, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, and that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives, and do not know it and do not want to know it. It is this crime for which we must repent first. The third element, expressing genuine remorse, requires apologizing. It means everyone who has contributed to or benefited from this harm, even those of us who have also harmed, even if less so than others were, should admit our role in it and say that we are sorry. This includes individuals addressing each other in our communities and our families in both private and public conversation. It includes leaders of and major investors in businesses that have profited from incarceration. It includes government actors who contributed to building incarceration as we know it. And it includes people currently positioned to speak on behalf of the government, such as elected officials, prosecutors, and judges. Speaking publicly about what is right, it is important not to underestimate the importance and potential impact of acknowledgement and apology. They have been demonstrated to have the capacity to transform relationships on both the individual and community level. It is equally important not to overestimate the importance and potential impact of acknowledgement and apology, as their real and lasting force takes hold only when coupled with acts of repair. Saying we are sorry calls for them doing sorry, the fourth element of accountability. when we come to this point of making repair concrete, people often get caught up in logistical concerns about how we might calculate what is owed and how the mechanisms for distribution of those resources would operate. I think these concerns largely miss the point. First, they dodge the fundamental moral issue of whether that repair is owed or not. If it is, then the question is not whether we know how to do it, but how we can figure it out. Second, these concerns tend to vastly overestimate the difficulty of redistributing resources. America has a long history of creating mechanisms to redistribute wealth. The violent takeover of colonization, in which we turn land into profit, and slavery, in which we turn human beings into profit, come to mind as some larger scale versions of transferring wealth from one group of people to another. In the other direction, though rarely, if ever, in ways that have been racially equitable, we have the New Deal and the Works Progress Administration, the GI Bill, and really virtually all government expenditure, which through taxation distributes individually held resources to public goods upon which everyone depends and to which everyone is entitled. In the international context, the Marshall Plan, which Eddie Ellis, the visionary founder of the Center for New Leadership on Urban Solutions, and more recently notable attorney and justice reform advocate Daryl Atkinson, have invoked as a model for reparations, offers an example of a package investment following harm. Some of these mechanisms follow periods of wartime and reflect a recognition that concentrated loss requires concentrated repair. Others are the ongoing ways in which a society generates the level of basic living standards and equity necessary to ensure not only justice but social order and peace. I am not an economist, and it is beyond the scope of this book to deliberate on the precise calculations or mechanisms for redistributing resources, but we are being dishonest if we pretend that this is not something we have the intellectual and practical capacity to do. America knows how to make money move. Yeah, she's not an economist, she admits. America knows how to make money move up. There's no problem with that. Redistributing resources up to the people, to the wealthy, is how the economy works. There has to be poor people in order for capitalism to work, in which it doesn't really work because it doesn't work for all people, but for the people that are in control of the economy, the very rich. In order for it to work for them, it has to have poor people, and it has to take their money as they make it and move it up. And she wants it to move down against the flow. And I don't think that there's any capacity for capitalism to do that. Maybe what she doesn't understand is that we have to get rid of capitalism to do any of the things that she is saying that we need to do in order to heal the pain of society and heal the pain of individuals that have been wronged. Crucially, repair does not have to happen at a single time or in a single way. The scope of harm we are repairing certainly did not. We might therefore envision countless municipal strategies to address housing discrimination across the country. Evanston, Illinois just came out with reparations for black people because of redlining that is documented in Evanston. local and regional strategies to address lynching and racial terror, regional and national strategies to address the legacy of slavery, and local, regional, and national strategies to address the harms of mass incarceration and of the violence it failed to prevent. These strategies, like the harms they address, could unfold on different and sometimes overlapping timelines and places, with some people participating in only one facet, some in several, and some in all. This debt is owed and keeps accruing, as author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates has written. Having been enslaved for 250 years, black people were not left to their own devices. They were terrorized. In the Deep South, a second slavery ruled. In the North, legislators, mayors, civic associations, banks, and citizens all colluded to pin black people into ghettos, where they were overcrowded, overcharged, and undereducated. Businesses discriminated against them, awarding them the worst jobs and the worst wages. Police brutalized them in the streets, and the notion that black lives, black bodies, and black wealth were rightful targets remained deeply rooted in the broader society. Now we have stepped away from our long centuries of despoilment, promising never again, but still we are haunted. It is as though we have run up a credit card bill and, having pledged to charge no more, remain befuddled that the balance does not disappear. The effects of that balance, interest accruing daily, are all around us. Critically, the debt is not just financial. Coates describes reparations not just as some hush money or payout, but as the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. It is not just a monetary debt that is owed, it is a moral one too. If we believe in the full humanity and belonging of every person in our nation, and if we know we have caused great harm to many of our own, then the only thing left to do is to try to make things as right as possible. I have long been persuaded that black people are entitled to reparations for slavery. I believe that workers should be paid for labor and compensated for the intergenerational impacts of mass-scale wage theft. I believe that people who have been violently injured deserve compensation for their pain. I believe that psychological damage is as important as physical injury and as deserving of repair. I believe that failing to address a set of wrongs of such a great scale as slavery effectively justifies those wrongs, normalizes them, excuses them, carries them into our present, and guarantees a future in which versions of them will persist. As I'm going to butcher her name, Fania, Fania Davis, has written, this is urgent. Continued failure to deal with our country's race-based historical traumas dooms us to perpetually reenact them. No, I got the hiccups. There is no new way forward without reconciling the debts of the past. I believe there is no expiration on the entitlement to repair, that it perseveres through generations just like the pain at its basis, and that time does not heal all wounds. Only healing heals all wounds. And as Sonia Shah, a leader in the restorative justice movement, reminds us, accountability and healing are inextricably linked. Well, that's powerful. Accountability and healing are inextricably linked. We have a severe case of a lack of accountability in Rockford with the police department and with the government. and racial injustice here in Rockford. And if we're to heal that, we need accountability. It will be hard, if not impossible, to fully disentangle the different dimensions of harm from one another. Ultimately, we are obligated to deal with all of it as the massive totality that it is. But we are equally obligated to acknowledge every last wound and every last sector of our lives in which pain has been inflicted and borne. I do not know how the sequencing and interplay of the various dimensions of reckoning should work. I do not know how we will hold the complex positions of non-black people of color in America. America, a country so essentially defined by the black-white binary and so filled with people who do not belong at either end. These questions will be ours to answer collectively. What I do know is that the pain we must address is at once so particular to individual people and specific systems, and at the same time so interconnected, so overlapping, and so intergenerational, that we will have to be ready for some nonlinear mess to unfold along the way, or perhaps more accurately as the way forward. However the process might unfold, a core dimension of the project of repair must include accounting for the harms of mass incarceration and for the violence it generates and fails to reduce. Some of the repair will be particular and individual. I think of this subset of what is owed almost as restitution rather than reparations. In the criminal justice context, we could see individualized financial restitution used as a means to address wrongful convictions, and lasting financial impact of unjust and outdated bail policies. The indefensible collection of fines and fees is in such a way as to debilitate the poor and much more. These amounts are particular and calculable. As Amanda Alexander of the Detroit Justice Project puts it, we have the receipts. It is not hard to imagine comparable forms of restitution for the results of housing discrimination and displacement, for the damage wrought by inequitable health care, for the wages stolen through convict leasing, and more. Along these various forms of individual restitution, some of this project of repair for mass incarceration will be collective and structural, because so much of the harm has been just that. This is the part I would call reparations. As we seek a pathway forward, we have the great benefit of the wisdom, advocacy, and organizing of many of the people who have paid the heaviest price for prison's failure and have already mapped out notions of what repair might look like. As with charting the course to repair the harms of slavery, many of these leaders are black Americans. But because mass incarceration has disproportionately harmed a wide range of people of color, not only black people, these leaders include people of other races, including leaders in Latino and Native American communities that have been devastated by incarceration and associated pain. If we are to rise to the vision they have put forward for us, we will demand an end to both mass incarceration and violence. We will make a commitment to real accountability for violence in a way that is more meaningful and more effective than incarceration. We will develop new strategies to address harm in communities without relying on police. We will expand restorative and transformative justice practices both within and beyond the criminal justice system. We will forge pathways to accountability rooted in the culture and beliefs of the people holding and being held accountable. We will demand healing opportunities as vast and accessible as our current change policy, and we will realign power. We will do this with crime survivors. formerly incarcerated people, and a fundamental commitment to human dignity at the center of all we do. We will experiment, we will imagine, and we will work. The new forms of responding to violence that we will develop will be imperfect methods, perhaps forever, but certainly at first. But they will grow in practice. They will develop the solidity that arises from time and experience. And they will become the very institutions that will anchor the culture we are now finally poised to build. In practice, some of these changes will include the expansion of alternatives to incarceration, as well as policy shifts in the development of a robust healing infrastructure. But because part of the problem at hand is an over-reliance on the criminal justice system to address broad social ills, repair will also require changes in practices entirely outside the criminal justice arena, including a realignment of policy and resources in education, housing, healthcare, wage equity, and the social service infrastructure as a whole. It will require raising our national standard for meeting everyone's basic needs and creating a context in which everyone can thrive. It will require changing the socioeconomic and structural conditions that make violence likely in the first place and that ensure its persistence. Similarly, when we recognize the ways in which our dependence on incarceration has fostered violence, whether by nurturing it directly through criminogenic features of prison, or indirectly through the divestment and social services that funding incarceration at this scale has required, we know the people to whom we owe repair include currently and formerly incarcerated people and their families, but also the crime survivors we have failed to keep safe or to help heal. They will also be included as we create spaces for truth-telling and recognition, publicly acknowledge harm that has occurred and the people who have survived it, name policy changes as act of repair, and compensate people who have been harmed with resources and opportunities that help them rebuild their lives and their communities. We have available to us models for addressing systemic harm. The Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa offers a large-scale reference point for contending with and seeking to transform the intergenerational impacts of structural racism. In Rwanda, the Truth Commission, or the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, offers an example of how a nation might carve a path forward among people in the aftermath of genocide. As Fania Davis has observed, these efforts as a whole are limited in that they strictly define and limit accountability to criminal prosecution and punishment for gross violation of human rights. They do not, therefore, include the range of people harmed, the range of people responsible, or all the elements of accountability, including, perhaps most essentially, repair, that are outlined here. Still, they each hold unquestionably useful lessons for what we choose to undertake. There are also narrower and nearer examples that provide critical insights. In Greensboro, North Carolina, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission addressed a 1979 Ku Klux Klan and Nazi attack on a group of protesters that left 5 dead and 10 injured. Central to the Commission's exploration and to the harm caused was the role of the police in sanctioning or at least failing to prevent the violence. In Maine, Native people convened the Maine Wabanaki State Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the harms caused by the child welfare system. The Black Women's Truth and Reconciliation Commission is addressing sexual violence as a human rights atrocity against women and girls of African descent, past and present. In Boston, a truth-seeking process is examining the violence associated with school desegregation. The Chicago Torture Justice Memorials Project and others secured reparations from the city of Chicago for victims of police torture. Leading reform advocates Dr. Alice Green and Cassandra Frederick have called for reparative justice responses to the war on drugs, and countless people across the country, including Fania Davis, have called for truth and reconciliation commissions to address the harm caused to black people in the United States, both by police and more broadly. In that realm, the visionary work of the Equal Justice Initiative has already undertaken so much of the practical and moral burden of documenting the history we will all have to repair. We are not without examples or guides. The act of truth-telling and repair that are at the heart of such processes are critical foundations for the fifth and final element of accountability, becoming people who will not cause harm again. That transformation requires both personal change and change in structures. To be more durable, people have to not want to and not be able to cause the same kind of harm again. Assuring that the harm will not recur therefore requires a realignment of power from those who have caused harm to those who have been harmed. With mass incarceration and violence, that realignment involves relocating the authority to define and secure safety to that, so that it shifts from the systems that have held the power to the communities that are most impacted. It means not only shrinking systems, but developing solutions that stand to replace them. And it means building political power to protect those changes from backsliding and backlash. The people whose lives are at stake will need to have the durable collective power to choose, implement, and sustain solutions. Because the repair at hand is structural, everyone who has been impacted, as people who have experienced harm, caused harm, or both, will have a role in driving, defining, and implementing repair. Central among those who will have to support this shift, and if history and culture are a guide, will be most likely to resist it, are white people. I believe that white people should participate in this shift for the benefit of people of color, but that is not the whole of it. What I have come to understand more recently is why we as white people need to engage in repair, not just for our own humanity, but for our own interests. The exercise we must undertake is not race neutral. Just as mass incarceration's impact has not been evenly distributed, so too must the repair be proportionate to the harm caused. That will mean a concentration of resources in communities of color. The repair must go to where the damage and therefore the debt incurred has been greatest, and we white people will need to be prepared for a substantial redistribution of resources towards communities of color throughout the country. This obligation is straightforward, if perhaps quite challenging for white people, particularly middle-class and wealthy white people whose families have not been affected by incarceration. This obligation is clear for white people who, even if they are relatively poor, have worked in jails or prisons or the industries connected to them, and so have profited directly from what we have done as a society. But our debt and obligation may seem complicated for white people who have benefited from their racial privilege, but at the same time have been on the losing side of class-based oppression that has led to incarcerating poor and working-class white people at rates vastly higher than their rich counterparts. What does this mean for poor and working class white people who have been locked up and survived violence? What if people both owe and are owed for this collective pain? However, central racial equity will be to structural change, addressing the harms of mass incarceration will also mean repair to the families of white people who have been devastated by prison and its lasting aftermath in people's lives. When it comes to broad-scale realignment of resources, the beneficiaries must include all people of color, but others too. Although the realignment of resources recommended here will begin to take from white people their relative advantage vis-a-vis people of color, for low-income white people, the changes proposed here will be overwhelmingly in their favor. The reinvestment of resources in schools, jobs, roads, treatment, hospitals, and healing will benefit white people whose communities have been under-resourced, partially as the result of our overinvestment in law enforcement, jails, and prisons. If our current system has pitted poor people of different races against each other in a way that is ultimately to the detriment of us all, then this realignment at its best will invert that pattern and create opportunities for shared struggle and well-being. White people, even when we are disadvantaged in the system, are still always better positioned than similarly situated people of color. So white people, even those of us who have been harmed by mass incarceration, cannot merely wait to become recipients of the benefits of this repair. We are, as we would say in restorative justice context, both harmed and responsible parties. And so we have to be active agents in bringing about that repair. We have to tell the truth about our pain, about what we have lost, about how mass incarceration has ravaged our lives and families. At the same time, we have to tell the truth about the ways in which we still got lighter sentences and better treatment than many people of color who committed the same crimes that we did. We have to name what was taken from us by this inhumane system, and we have to acknowledge that we were given even in the belly of that beast that folks of color never received. We have to fight for more sensible sentencing, fair policing, humane distribution of resources, accessible healing, durable change, fixing what is broken, and building what we want in its place. We have to advocate for these things for ourselves and to fulfill our role in the larger repair. We have to ensure that our demands are not met at the expense of others, as they have been for so long, but rather we must insist on a rising tide that raises all ships. As my incisive friend and colleague Lorenzo Jones put it, poor and formerly incarcerated white people have to fight for what they're due, and they have to make sure everyone gets it. And for white people who have been fully insulated from the ravages of mass incarceration, well, we just have to be ready to make thorough, vast, and overdue amends. We have to steer into our reckoning. That is, admittedly, a lot to ask. Most people don't take the opportunity to choose a reckoning. Most wait for it to come to them, though it is always worse when it does. It is like the choice between going to the doctor when we feel a faint but troubling pain in our chest, or waiting till we collapse in the street to address it. It is always better to go by choice, but that does not always mean we go. Nor does it ever mean the doctor's news for us is good. Being honest about what we have done will not be easy, nor should we expect to be greeted with an open, forgiving embrace from those whose lives we have destroyed brutally for generations. The grace on the other side of reckoning is matched only by the rage and pain and messiness of the road there. I do believe, based on history and analysis, that choosing such a reckoning is both logical and practical. I also believe it is an act of faith. In cases of interpersonal wrongdoing, accountability is to those responsible for harm what grief is to those harmed. It is an unparalleled tool for responsible parties to transform their shame, and in doing so to recuperate a sense of dignity, self-worth, connectedness, and hope, the things they lost when they caused harm. Accountability is essential as any grieving process to restoring us to our best selves. I think that holds true in the context of large-scale social harm as well. If it is true that when we hurt people we feel shame, that shame drives violence, and that the only pathway out of shame is through accountability, then the pathway out of mass incarceration and the violence that comes with it must include accountability. Not just because those harmed deserve it, but because those of us who have contributed to or benefited from that harm deserve it too. In the toughest and kindest senses of the word deserve, I believe that white people know on some level what we have done. I believe that because we are human, and because human beings are fundamentally good, we feel ashamed of those choices and their impact. I believe that shame is compounded when people we love are caught up in the systems we have condoned. And I believe, because we are human, that until that shame is resolved, we will do what ashamed humans do. We will act it out as violence. We will do that interpersonally in our own families and communities. And because we have more access to structural power, we will do it through institutions, including most centrally, for the challenge explored here, through the criminal justice system. We will justify our inhumanity towards other people by making claims that they are inhuman, because only then will we feel any insulation from our shame for hurting them so terribly. We will punish more and more harshly, as if to prove that we were not wrong about who those people are, because if we are wrong, then we have done an unimaginable, terrible, even an irreparable thing. If we do not resolve our shame, we will do what Dr. James Gilligan saw countless people do. We will seek to eradicate the witnesses of our wrongdoing. We will do so through violence, our own violence and the violence of the state that acts in our names. We will do so through exclusion, including one of the largest scale mass exclusion experiments in human history, in which we literally send people somewhere we refer to only as away, mass incarceration. And we will do so through attempts to add erasure, by retelling history in a way that excludes the basis for our responsibility or the evidence of its effects on others. None of this will work. All of the harm we do to escape the reckoning will only add to the toll for which we ultimately have to answer. Because while shame compels us to violence, violence does not resolve our shame. Only accountability does. And so white folks in America have terrifyingly, urgently, blessedly a choice. We can continue to act out of shame, stuck in its clutches, diminished by its force, constrained by its power over us, or we can rise out of it through accountability. We can say that what we did was wrong. We can say that we know it hurt people. We can say it, we are sorry. We can do sorry, taking actions to make the harms of the past as right as possible. And we can begin to become a people who will never do it again. When we do that, I believe we will reap benefits that are unimaginable to us from this side of that reckoning. I believe not only will we regain our dignity, self-worth, connectedness, and hope, I believe we will be able to give and receive love and more and better than we've ever known. I believe we will be able to feel proud, not because we are superior to other people, but because we are superior to our own former selves. We will become people who are better, not better than others, but better than we once were. We will become people who have earned our dignity, and for those of us who are poor, we will become people who can finally align with people of color who share our conditions and fight to get the wages, housing, health care, and protections we have always deserved. In all of this, many of us, not just white people, will be tempted to look only forward because what is behind us is so hard to face. We will want to do it once at most and say we are done, but only the discipline of anchoring our future in our past, not in a way that is constrained by it, but in a way that grows from it, will honor everyone who has been harmed and will strengthen those of us who have caused harm, and our ongoing accountable rise out of shame. And for those we have hurt, like for most survivors of violence, what will happen on the other side of such a process? What healing or rage or transformation may arise from it is unknowable on this side. But the fact that it is unknowable does not make it any less urgent or any less deserved. One thing all of this collective labor to address the harms of mass incarceration and violence will buy America is the chance to build something new in the place of what we are working to end. Our aim cannot only be less use of broken strategy, it has to be the development and expansion of better, more effective, more humane strategies. Of the key facts of sound responses to violence, survivor-centered, accountability-based, safety-driven, and racially equitable, the first three sound so familiar: victims, accountability, and safety. These three have been deployed to advance draconian criminal justice policy for decades, but these principles belong to those of us who are fighting for a more just system. They are ours. And when we do the work of building alternatives to the system as it is, it turns out that not only do we believe them more deeply, we are better at them too. In the end, we do not have to just push back against the system as we know it. We have to render the system obsolete. One day we will tell the history of how these new ways of being came to be, and that history will include the fact that we told the truth, that we who were responsible said we were sorry, and that we all did something different from what we had done. If, and I believe only if, we do that, we can, as James Baldwin foretold, make America what America must become. When I think about the road to repair, I do not believe that those of us who have had the fortune to participate in accountability processes, including restorative justice circles, have everything that is needed to displace mass incarceration. But I do believe we have something essential to offer. We know a thing about reckoning. I have had the huge privilege of